My Autobiography by Benito Mussolini, with a foreword by Richard Washburn Child, former ambassador to Italy. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1928. Foreword by Richard Washburn Child. It is far from my purpose to elaborate the material in this book, to interpret it, or to add to it. With much of the drama it contains, I, being ambassador of the United States at the time, was intimately familiar. Much of the extraordinary personality disclosed here was an open book to me long ago because I knew well the man who now, at last, has written characteristically, directly, and simply of that self for which I have a deep affection. For his autobiography, I am responsible. Lives of Mussolini written by others have interests of sorts, but nothing can take the place of a book which you will write yourself, I said to him. Write myself? He leaned across his desk and repeated my phrase in amazement. He is the busiest single individual in the world. He appeared hurt, as if a friend had failed to understand. Yes, I said, and showed him a series of headings I had written on a few sheets of paper. All right, he said in English. I will. It was quite like him. He decides quickly and completely. So he began. He dictated. I advise that method because when he attempts to write in longhand, he corrects and corrects and corrects. It would have been too much for him, so he dictated. The copy came back, and he interlined the manuscript in his own hand. A dash of red pencil and a flowing rivulet of ink here and there. When the manuscripts began to come to me, I was troubled because mere literal translators lose the vigor of the man himself. What editing may I do? I asked him. Any that you like, he said. You know Italy, you understand fascism, you see me as clearly as anyone. But there was nothing much to do. The story came through as it appears here. It is all his, and what luck for all of us, so like him. Approve of him or not, when one reads this book, one may know Mussolini, or at least, if one's vision is clouded, know him better. Like the book or not, there is not an insincere line in it. I find none. Of course, there are many things which a man writing an autobiography cannot see about himself, or will not say about himself. He is unlikely to speak of his own size on the screen of history. Perhaps when approval or disapproval, theories and isms, pros and cons are all put aside, the only true measure of a man's greatness from a wholly unpartisan viewpoint may be found in the answer to this question. How deep and lasting has been the effect of a man upon the largest number of human beings? Their hearts, their thoughts, their material welfare, their relation to the universe. In our time, it may be shrewdly forecast that no man will exhibit dimensions of permanent greatness equal to those of Mussolini. Admire him or not, approve of his philosophies or not, concede the permanence of his success or not, consider him Superman or not, as you may, he has put to a working test on great and growing numbers of mankind, programs unknown before in applied spirituality, in applied plans, in applied leadership, in applied doctrines, in the applied principle that contents are more important than labels on bottles. He has not only been able to secure and hold an almost universal following, he has built a new state upon a new concept of a state. He has not only been able to change the lives of human beings, but he has changed their minds, their hearts, their spirits. He has not merely ruled a house, he has built a new house. He has not merely put it on paper or into orations, he has laid the bricks. It is one thing to administer a state. The one who does this well is called a statesman. It is another thing to make a state. Mussolini has made a state. That is super statesmanship. I knew him before the world at large outside of Italy had ever heard of him. I knew him before and after the moment he leaped into the saddle, and in the days when he, almost single-handed, was clearing away chaos's own junk pile from Italy. But no man knows Mussolini. An Italian newspaper offered a prize for the best essay showing insight into the mystery of the man. Mussolini, the story goes, stopped the contest by writing to the paper that such a competition was absurd because he himself could not enter an opinion. In spite of quick, firm decisions, in spite of grim determination, in spite of a well-ordered, diagrammed pattern and plan of action fitted to any moment of time, Mussolini, first of all, above all, and after all, is a personality always in a state of flux, adjusting its leadership to a world eternally in a state of flux. Change the facts upon which Mussolini has acted, and he will change his action. Change the hypotheses, and he will change his conclusion. And this perhaps is an attribute of greatness seldom recognized. Most of us are forever hoping to put our world in order and finish the job. Statesmen with some idea to make over into reality hope for a day when they can say, well, that's done. And when it's done, often enough it is nothing. The bridges they have built are now useless because the rivers have all changed in their courses and humanity is already shrieking for new bridges. This is not an unhappy thought, says Mussolini. A finished world would be a stupid place, intolerably stupid. The imagination of mere statesmen covers a static world. The imagination of true greatness covers a dynamic world. Mussolini conceives a dynamic world. He is ready to go on the march with it, though it overturns all his structures, upsets all his theories, destroys all of yesterday, and creates a screaming dawn of a tomorrow. Opportunist is a term of reproach used to brand men who fit themselves to conditions for reasons of self-interest. Mussolini, as I have learned to know him, is an opportunist in the sense that he believes that mankind itself must be fitted to changing conditions rather than to fixed theories, no matter how many hopes and prayers have been expended on theories and programs. He has marched up several hills with the thousands and then marched down again. This strange creature of strange life and strange thoughts with that almost psychopathic fire which was in saints and villains, in Napoleons, in Jeanne d'Arcs, in Tolstoys, in religious prophets, and in Ingersoll's, has been up the socialist, the international, the liberal, and the conservative hills, and down again. He says, the sanctity of an ism is not in the ism. It has no sanctity beyond its power to do, to work, to succeed in practice. It may have succeeded yesterday and fail tomorrow, failed yesterday and succeeded tomorrow. The machine, first of all, must run. I have watched, with a curiosity that has never failed to creep in on me, the marked peculiarities, physical and mental, of this man. At moments he is quite relaxed, at ease, and yet the unknown gusts of his own personality play on him eternally. One sees in his eyes, or in a quick movement of his body, or in a sentence suddenly ejaculated the effect of these gusts, just as one sees wind on the surface of the water. There is in his walk something of a prowl, a faint suggestion of the tread of the cat. He likes cats, their independence, their decision, their sense of justice, and their appreciation of the sanctity of the individual. He even likes lions and lionesses, and plays with them until those who guard his life protest against their social set. His principal pet is a Persian feline which, being of aristocratic lineage, nevertheless exhibits a pride not only of ancestry, but, condescendingly, of belonging to Mussolini. And yet, in spite of his own prowl as he walks along in his riding boots, springy, active, ready to leap, it seems there is little else feline about him. One quality is feline, however. It is the sense of his complete isolation. One feels that he must always have had this isolation. Isolation as a boy, isolation as a young radical, adventurer, lover, worker, thinker. There is no understudy of Mussolini. There is no man, woman, or child who stands anywhere in the inner orbit of his personality. No one. The only possible exception is his daughter Edda. All the tales of his alliances, his obligations, his ties, his predilections are errant nonsense. There are none. No ties, no predilections, no alliances, no obligations unpaid. Financially, lying voices said that he had been personally financed and backed by the industrialists of Italy. This is ridiculous to those who know. His salary is almost nothing. His own family, wife, children, are poor. Politically, whom could he owe? He has made and can unmake them all. He is free to test every office holder in the whole of Italy by the yardstick of service and fitness. Beyond that, I know not one political debt that he owes. He has tried to pay those of the past. I believe that the cynicism in him is based upon the failure of some who have been rewarded to live up to the trust put in them. But I take the responsibility for all, says he. He says it publicly with jaws firm. He says it privately with eyes somewhat saddened. He takes responsibility for everything. For discipline, for censorship, for measures which, were less rigor required, would appear repressive and cruel. Mine, says he, and stands or falls on that. It is an admirable courage. I could, if I wish, quote instance after instance of this acceptance, sometimes when he is not to blame, of the whole responsibility of the machine. Mine, says he, and in spite of any disillusionment he has suffered since I knew him first, he has retained his laugh. Often one is bound to say a scornful laugh, and he has kept his faith in an ability to build up a machine, the machine of fascism, the machine built not on any fixed theory, but one intended by Mussolini to run, above all, to run, to function, to do, to accomplish, to fill the bottles with wine first, unlike the other isms, and put the labels on after. Mussolini has superstitious faith in himself. He has said it. Not a faith in himself to make a personal gain. An assassin's bullet might wipe him out and leave his family in poverty. That would be that. His faith is in a kind of destiny, which will allow him, before the last chapter, to finish the building of this new state, this new machine, the machine which will run and has a soul. The first time I ever saw him, he came to my residence sometime before the March on Rome, and I asked him what would be his program for Italy. His answer was immediate: work and discipline. I remember I thought at the time that the phrase sounded a little evangelical, a phrase of exhortation, but a mere demagogue would never choose it. Wilson's slogans of rights and peace and freedom are much more popular and gain easier currency than sterner phrases. It is easier even for a sincere preacher to offer soft nests to one's followers. It is more difficult to excite enthusiasm for stand-up doctrines. Any analysis and weighing of Mussolini's greatness must include recognition that he has made popular throughout a race of people, and perhaps for others, a standard of obligation of the individual, not only exacting, but one which in the end will be accepted voluntarily. Not only is it accepted voluntarily, but with an almost spiritual ecstasy, which has held up miraculously in Italy during years when all of the so-called liberals in the world were hovering over it like vultures, croaking that if it were not dead, it was about to die. It is difficult to lead men at all. It is still more difficult to lead them away from self-indulgence. It is still more difficult to lead them so that a new generation, so that the youth itself appears as if born with a new spirit, a new virility bred in the bones. It is difficult to govern a state and difficult to deal cleanly and strongly with a static program applied to a static world, but it is more difficult to build a new state and deal cleanly and strongly with a dynamic program applied to a dynamic world. This man who looks up at me with that peculiar nodding of his head and raising of the eyebrows has done it. There are few in the world's history who have. I had considered the phrase work and discipline as a worthy slogan, as a good label for an empty bottle. Within 6 years, this man, with a professional opposition which first barked like Pomeranians at the heels and then ran away to bark abroad, has made the label good, has filled the bottle, has turned concept into reality. It is quite possible for those who oppose the concept to say that the reality of the new spirit of Italy and its extent of full acceptance by the people may exist in the mind of Mussolini, but does not spring out of the people themselves. But it is quite untrue, as all know who really know. He throws up his somewhat stubby, meaty, short-fingered hands, strong and yet rather ghost-like when one touches them, and laughs. Like Roosevelt. No one can spend much time with him without thinking that, after all, there are two kinds of leaders, outdoor and indoor leaders, and that the first are somewhat more magnetic, more lasting, and more boyish and likable for their power than the indoor kind. Mussolini, like Roosevelt, gives the impression of an energy which cannot be bottled, which bubbles up and over like an eternally effervescent, irrepressible fluid. At these moments one remembers his playing of the violin, his fencing, his playful, mischievous humor, the dash of his courage, his contact with animals, his success in making gay marching songs for the old drab struggles of mankind with the soil, with the elements, with the oars in the earth and the pathways of the seas. In the somber conclusions of the student statesman, and in the sweetness of the sentimentalist statesman, there is little joy. Unexpected joy is found in the leadership of a Mussolini. Battle becomes a game. The game becomes a romp. It is absurd to say that Italy groans under discipline. Italy chortles with it. It is victory. He is a Spartan, too. Perhaps we need them in the world today, especially that type whose first interest is the development of the power and the happiness of a race. The last time I took leave of Mussolini, he came prowling across the room as I went toward the door. His scowl had gone. The evening had come. There had been a half-hour of quiet conversation. The strained expression had fallen from his face. He came toward me and rubbed his shoulder against the wall. He was relaxed and quiet. I remembered Lord Curzon's impatience with him long ago when Mussolini had first come into power, and Curzon used to refer to him as that absurd man. Time has shown that he was neither violent nor absurd. Time has shown that he is both wise and humane. It takes the world a long time to see what has been dropped into the pan of its old scales. In terms of fundamental and permanent effect upon the largest number of human beings, whether one approves or detests him, the Duce is now the greatest figure of this sphere and time. One closes the door when one leaves him feeling, as when Roosevelt was left, that one could squeeze something of him out of one's clothes. He is a mystic to himself. I imagine as he reaches forth to touch reality in himself, he finds that he himself has gone a little forward, isolated, determined, elusive, untouchable, just out of reach. Onward. My Autobiography. Chapter 1. A Sulphurous Land. Almost all the books published about me put squarely and logically on the first page that which may be called my birth certificate. It is usually taken from my own notes. Well, then here it is again. I was born on July 29th, 1883, at Varano di Costa. This is an old hamlet. It is on a hill. The houses are of stone, and sunlight and shade give the walls and roofs a variegated color, which I well remember. The hamlet, where the air is pure and the view agreeable, overlooks the village of Dovia, and Dovia is in the commune or county of Predappio in the northeast of Italy. It was at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon when I came into the world. It was by chance the festival day of the patron saint of the old church and parish of Caminate. On the structure, a ruined tower overlooks proudly and solemnly the whole plain of Forli, a plain which slopes gently down from the Apennines with their snow-clad tops in winter to the undulating bottoms of Ravallino, where the mists gather in summer nights. Let me add to the atmosphere of a country dear to me by bringing again to my memory the old district of Predappio. It was a country well known in the 13th century, giving birth to illustrious families during the Renaissance. It is a sulphurous land. From it, the ripening grapes make a strong wine of fine perfume. There are many springs of iodine waters, and on that plain and those undulating foothills and mountain spurs, the ruins of medieval castles and towers thrust up their gray-yellow walls toward the pale blue sky in testimony of the virility of centuries now gone. Such was the land dear to me because it was my soil. Race and soil are strong influences upon us all. As for my race, my origin, many persons have studied and analyzed its hereditary aspects. There is nothing very difficult in tracing my genealogy, because from parish records, it is very easy for friendly research to discover that I came from a lineage of honest people. They tilled the soil, and because of its fertility, they earned the right to their share of comfort and ease. Going further back, one finds that the Mussolini family was prominent in the city of Bologna in the 13th century. In 1270, Giovanni Mussolini was the leader of this warlike, aggressive commune. His partner in the rule of Bologna in the days of armored knights was Fulciere Paolucci di Calboli, who belonged to a family from Predappio also, and even today that is one of the distinguished families. The destinies of Bologna and the internal struggles of its parties and factions following the eternal conflicts and changes in all struggles for power caused, at last, the exile of the Mussolinis to Argelato. From there, they scattered into neighboring provinces. One may be sure that in that era their adventures were varied, and sometimes in the flux of fortune brought them to hard times. I have never discovered news of my forebears in the 17th century. In the 18th century, there was a Mussolini in London. Italians never hesitate to venture abroad with their genius or their labors. The London Mussolini was a composer of music of some note, and perhaps it was from him that I inherit the love of the violin, which even today in my hands gives comfort to moments of relaxation and creates for me moments of release from the realities of my days. Later, in the 19th century, the family tie became more clearly defined. My own grandfather was a lieutenant of the National Guard. My father was a blacksmith, a heavy man with strong, large, fleshy hands. Alessandro, the neighbors called him. Heart and mind were always filled and pulsing with socialistic theories. His intense sympathies mingled with doctrines and causes. He discussed them in the evening with his friends, and his eyes filled with light. The international movement attracted him, and he was closely associated with names known among the followers of social causes in Italy: Andrea Costa, Balducci, Amilcare, Cipriani, and even the more tender and pastoral spirit of Giovanni Pascoli. So come and go men whose minds and souls are striving for good ends. Each conference seems to them to touch the fate of the world. Each talisman seems to promise salvation. Each theory pretends to immortality. The Mussolinis had left some permanent marks. In Bologna, there is still a street named for that family, and not long ago, a tower and a square bore the name. Somewhere in the heraldic records, there is the Mussolini coat of arms. It has a rather pleasing and perhaps magnificent design. There are 6 black figures in a yellow field, symbols of valor, courage, force. My childhood, now in the mists of distance, still yields those flashes of memory that come back with a familiar scene, an aroma which the nose associates with damp earth after a rain in the springtime, or the sound of footsteps in the corridor. A roll of thunder may bring back the recollection of the stone steps where a little child, who seems no longer any part of oneself, used to play in the afternoon. Out of those distant memories, I received no assurance that I had the characteristics which are supposed to traditionally make parents overjoyed at the perfection of their offspring. I was not a good boy, nor did I stir the family pride or the dislike of my own associates in school by standing at the head of my class. I was then a restless being. I am still. Then I could not understand why it is necessary to take time in order to act. Rest for restfulness meant nothing to me then any more than now. I believe that in those youthful years, just as now, my day began and ended with an act of will. By will put into action. Looking back, I cannot see my early childhood as being either praiseworthy or as being any more than normal in every direction. I remember my father as a dark-haired, good-natured man, not slow to laugh, with strong features and steady eyes. I remember that near the house where I was born, with its stone wall and moss green in the crevices, there was a small brook, and farther on, a little river. Neither had much water in it. But in autumn, and in other seasons when there were unexpected heavy rains, they swelled in fury, and their torrents were joyous challenges to me. I remember them as my first play spots. With my brother Arnaldo, who is now the publisher of the daily Popolo d'Italia, I used to try my skill as a builder of dams to regulate the current. When birds were in their nesting season, I was a frantic hunter for their concealed and varied homes with their eggs or young birds. Vaguely, I sensed in all this the rhythm of natural progress, a peep into the world of eternal wonder, of flux and change. I was passionately fond of young life. I wished to protect it then as I do now. My greatest love was for my mother. She was so quiet, so tender, and yet so strong. Her name was Rosa. My mother not only reared us, but she taught primary school. I often thought in my earliest appreciation of human beings how faithful and patient her work was. To displease her was my one fear. So, to hide from her my pranks, my naughtiness, or some result of mischievous frolic, I used to enlist my grandmother and even the neighbors, for they understood my panic lest my mother should be disturbed. The alphabet was my first practice in worldly affairs, and I learned it in a rush of enthusiasm. Without knowing why, I found myself wishing to attend school, the school at Predappio, some 2 miles away. It was taught by Marani, a friend of my father. I walked to and fro and was not displeased that the boys of Predappio resented at first the coming of a stranger boy from another village. They flung stones at me, and I returned their fire. I was all alone against many. I was often beaten, but I enjoyed it with that universality of enjoyment with which boys the world around make friendship by battle, and arrive at affection through missiles. Whatever was my courage, my body bore its imprints. I concealed the bruises from my mother to shelter her from the knowledge of the world in which I had begun to find expression, and to which I suppose she was such a stranger. At the evening repast, I probably often feared to stretch out my hand for the bread lest I expose a wound upon my young wrist. After a while, this all ended. War was over, and the pretense of enmity, a form of play, faded into nothing, and I had found fine schoolmates of my own age. The call of old life foundations is strong. I felt it when only a few years ago a terrific avalanche endangered the lives of the inhabitants of Predappio. I took steps to found a new Predappio, Predappio Nuovo. My nature felt a stirring for my old home, and I remembered that as a child I had sometimes looked at the plain where the river Rappi is crossed by the old highway to Mendola, and imagined there a flourishing town. Today that town, Predappio Nuovo, is in full process of development. On its masonry gate there is carved, the symbol of fascism, and words expressing my clear will. When I was graduated from the lower school, I was sent to a boarding school. This was at Faenza, the town noted for its pottery of the 15th century. The school was directed by the Salesiani priests. I was about to enter a period of routine, of learning the ways of the disciplined human herd. I studied, slept well, and grew. I was awake at daylight, and went to bed when the evening had settled down and the bats flew. This was a period of bursting beyond the bounds of my own little town. I had begun to travel, I had begun to add length after length to that tether which binds one to the hearth and the village. I saw the town of Forli, a considerable place which should have impressed me, but failed to do so. But Ravenna! Some of my mother's relatives lived in the plain of Ravenna, and on one summer vacation we set out together to visit them. After all, it was not far away, but to my imagination it was like a great journey, almost like a journey of Marco Polo, to go over a hill and dale to the edge of the sea, the Adriatic. I went with my mother to Ravenna and carefully visited every corner of that city steeped in the essences of antiquity. From the wealth of Ravenna's artistic treasures, there rose before me the beauty and fascination of her history and her name through the long centuries. Deep feelings remain now, impressed then upon me. I experienced a profound and significant enlarging of my concepts of life, beauty, and the rise of civilizations. The tomb of Dante, inspiring in its quiet hour of noon. The Basilica of San Apollinare, the Candiano Canal with the pointed sails of fishing boats at its mouth. And then, the beauty of the Adriatic moved me, touched something within me. I went back with something new and undying. My mind and spirit were filled with expanding consciousness. And I took back also a present from my relatives. It was a wild duck, powerful in flight. My brother Arnaldo and I, on the little river at home, put forth patient efforts to tame the wild duck. Chapter 2. My Father. My father took a profound interest in my development. Perhaps I was much more observed by his paternal attention than I thought. We became much more knit together by common interests as my mind and my body approached maturity. In the first place, I became fascinated by the steam threshing machines which were just then for the first time being introduced into our agricultural life. With my father, I went to work to learn the mechanism and tasted, as I had never tasted before, the quiet joy of becoming a part of the working creative world. Machinery has its fascinations, and I can understand how an engineer of a railway locomotive or an oiler in the hold of a ship may feel that a machine has a personality, sometimes irritating, sometimes friendly, with an inexhaustible generosity and helpfulness, power and wisdom. But manual labor in my father's blacksmith shop was not the only common interest we shared. It was inevitable that I should find a clearer understanding of those political and social questions which, in the midst of discussions with the neighbors, had appeared to me as unfathomable, and hence a stupid world of words. I could not follow as a child the arguments of lengthy debates around the table, nor did I grasp the reasons for the watchfulness and measures taken by the police. But now, in an obscure way, it all appeared as connected with the lives of strong men, who not only dominate their own lives, but the lives of their fellow creatures. Slowly but fatally, I was turning my spirit and my mind to new political ideals destined to flower for a time. I began with young eyes to see that the tiny world about me was feeling uneasiness under the pinch of necessity. A deep and secret grudge was darkening the hearts of the common people. A country gentry of mediocrity in economic usefulness and of limited intellectual contribution were hanging upon the multitudes a weight of unjustified privileges. These were sad, dark years, not only in my own province, but for other parts of Italy. I must have the marks upon my memory of the resentful and furtive protests of those who came to talk with my father, some with bitterness of facts, some with a newly devised hope for some reform. It was then, while I was still in my early teens, that my parents, after many serious talks ending with a rapid family council, turned the rudder of my destiny in a new direction. They said that my manual work did not correspond to their ambitions for me, to their ability to aid me, nor did it fit my own capacities. My mother had a phrase which remains in my ears: "He promises something." At the time, I was not very enthusiastic about that conclusion. I had no real hunger for scholastic endeavor. I did not feel that I would languish if I did not go to a normal school and did not prepare to become a teacher. But my family were right. I had developed some capacities as a student and could increase them. I went to the normal school at a place called Forlimpopoli. I remember my arrival in that small city. The citizens were cheerful and industrious, good at bargaining, tradesmen and middlemen. The school, however, had a greater distinction. It was conducted by Valfredo Carducci, brother of the great writer Giosuè Carducci, who at that time was harvesting his laurels because of his poetry and his inspiration drawn from Roman classicism. There was a long stretch of study ahead of me. To become a master, to have a teacher's diploma, meant 6 years of books and pencils, ink and paper. I confess that I was not very assiduous. The bright side of those years of preparation to be a teacher came from my interest in reforming educational methods, and even more in an interest begun at that time and maintained ever since, an intense interest in the psychology of human masses, the crowd. I was, I believe, unruly, and I was sometimes indiscreet. Youth has its passing restlessness and follies. Somehow I succeeded in gaining forgiveness. My masters were understanding and on the whole generous. But I have never been able to make up my mind how much of the indulgence accorded to me came from any hope that they had in me, or how much came from the fact that my father had acquired an increasing reputation for his moral and political integrity. So the diploma came to me at last. I was a teacher. Many are the men who have found activity in political life who began as teachers. But then I saw only the prospect of the hard road of job hunting, letters of recommendation, scraping up a backing of influential persons, and so on. In a competition for a teacher's place at Gualtieri, in the province of Reggio Emilia, I was successful. I had my taste of it. I taught for a year. On the last day of the school year, I dictated an essay. I remember its thesis. It was, "By persevering, you arrive." For that, I obtained the praise of my superiors. So school was closed. I did not want to go back to my family. There was a narrow world for me, with affection to be sure, but restricted. There in Predappio, one could neither move nor think without feeling at the end of a short rope. I had become conscious of myself, sensitive to my future. I felt the urge to escape. Money I had not. Merely a little. Courage was my asset. I would be an exile. I crossed the frontier. I entered Switzerland. It was in this wander life, now full of difficulties, toil, hardship, and restlessness, that developed something in me. It was the milestone which marked my maturity. I entered into this new era as a man and politician. My confident soul began to be my support. I conceded nothing to pious demagoguery. I allowed myself, humble as was my figure, to be guided by my innate proudness, and I saw myself in my own mental dress. To this day, I think difficulties. They were more numerous than the nice, happy incidents, but the latter gave me nothing. The difficulties of life have hardened my spirit. They have taught me how to live. For me, it would have been dreadful and fatal if on my journey forward I had by chance fallen permanently into the chains of comfortable bureaucratic employment. How could I have adapted myself to that smug existence in a world bristling with interest and significant horizons? How could I have tolerated the halting progress of promotions, comforted and yet irritated by the thoughts of an old age pension at the end of the dull road? Any comfortable cranny would have sapped my energies. These energies which I enjoy were trained by obstacles and even by bitterness of soul. They were made by struggle, not by the joys of the pathway. My stay in Switzerland was a welter of difficulties. It did not last long, but it was angular with harsh points. I worked with skill as a laborer. I worked usually as a mason and felt the fierce, grim pleasure of construction. I made translations from Italian into French and vice versa. I did whatever came to hand. I looked upon my friends with interest or affection or amusement. Above all, I threw myself head foremost into the politics of the emigrant, of refugees, of those who sought solutions. In politics, I never gained a penny. I detest those who live like parasites, sucking away at the edges of social struggles. I hate men who grow rich in politics. I knew hunger, stark hunger, in those days. But I never bent myself to ask for loans, and I never tried to inspire the pity of those around me, nor of my own political companions. I reduced my needs to a minimum, and that minimum, and sometimes less, I received from home. With a kind of passion, I studied social sciences. Pareto was giving a course of lectures in Lausanne on political economy. I looked forward to every one. The mental exercise was a change from manual labor. My mind leaped toward this change, and I found pleasure in learning. For here was a teacher who was outlining the fundamental economic philosophy of the future. Between one lesson and another, I took part in political gatherings. I made speeches. Some intemperance in my words made me undesirable to the Swiss authorities. They expelled me from 2 cantons. The university courses were over. I was forced into new places, and not until 1922, at the Conference of Lausanne, after I was Premier of Italy, did I see again some of my old haunts, filled with memories colorful or drab. To remain in Switzerland became impossible. There was the yearning for home which blossoms in the hearts of all Italians. Furthermore, the compulsory service in the army was calling me. I came back. There were greetings, questions, all the incidents of the return of an adventurer, and then I joined the regiment, a Bersaglieri regiment at the historic city of Verona. The Bersaglieri wear green cock feathers on their hats. They are famous for their fast pace, a kind of monotonous and ground-covering dog trot, and for their discipline and spirit. I liked the life of a soldier. The sense of willing subordination suited my temperament. I was preceded by a reputation of being restless, a fire-eater, a radical, a revolutionist. Consider then the astonishment of the captain, the major, and my old colonels, who were compelled to speak of me with praise. It was my opportunity to show serenity of spirit and strength of character. Verona, where my regiment was garrisoned, was and always will remain a dear Venetian city, reverberating with the past, filled with suggestive beauties. I found in my own temperament an echo of infinite resonance. I enjoyed its aromas as a man, but also as a private soldier I entered with vim into all the drills and the most difficult exercises. I found an affectionate regard for the mass, for the whole, made up of individuals, for its maneuvers and the tactics, the practice of defense and attack. My capacity was that of a simple soldier, but I used to weigh the character, abilities, and individualities of those who commanded me. All Italian soldiers to a certain extent do this. I learned in that way how important it is for an officer to have a deep knowledge of military matters and to develop a fine sensitiveness to the ranks, and to appreciate in the masses of our men our stern Latin sense of discipline, and to be susceptible to its enchantments. I can say that in every regard I was an excellent soldier. I might have taken up the courses for non-commissioned officers, but destiny, which dragged me from my father's blacksmith shop to teaching, and from teaching to exile, and from exile to discipline, now decreed that I should not become a professional soldier. I had to ask for leave. At the time, I swallowed the greatest sorrow in my life. It was the death of my mother. One day, my captain took me aside. He was so considerate that I felt in advance something impending. He asked me to read a telegram. It was from my father. My mother was dying. He urged my return. I rushed to catch the first train. I arrived too late. My mother was in death's agony. But from an almost imperceptible nod of her head, I realized that she knew I had come. I saw her endeavor to smile, then her head slowly drooped, and she had gone. All the independent strength of my soul, all my intellectual or philosophical resources, even my deep religious beliefs were helpless to comfort that great grief. For many days I was lost. From me had been taken the one dear and truly near living being, the one soul closest and eternally adherent to my own responses. Words of condolence, letters from my friends, the attempt to comfort me by other members of my family, filled not one tiny corner of that great void, nor opened even one fraction of an inch of the closed door. My mother had suffered for me in so many ways. She had lived so many hours of anxiety for me because of my wandering and pugnacious life. She had predicted my ascent. She had toiled and hoped too much and died before she was yet 48 years old. She had, in her quiet manner, done superhuman labors. She might be alive now. She might have lived and enjoyed with the power of her maternal instinct my political success. But it was not to be. But to me, it is a comfort to feel that she, even now, can see me and help me in my labors with her unequaled love. I, alone, returned to the regiment. I finished my last months of military service. And then my life and my future were again distended with uncertainty. I went to Opelia as a teacher again, knowing all the time that teaching did not suit me. This time I was a master in a middle school. After a period, off I went with Cesare Battisti, then chief editor of the Popolo. Later, he was destined to become one of the greatest of our national heroes. He who gave his life. He who was executed by the enemy Austrians in the war. He who then was giving his thought and will to obtaining freedom of the province of Trento from the rule of Austria. His nobility and proud soul are always in my memory. His aspirations as a socialist patriot called to me. One day I wrote an article maintaining that the Italian border was not at Ala, the little town which in those days stood at the old frontier between our kingdom and the old Austria. Whereupon I was expelled from Austria by the imperial and royal government of Vienna. I was becoming used to expulsions. Once more a wanderer, I went back to Forli. The itch of journalism was in me. My opportunity was before me in the editorship of a local socialist newspaper. I understood now that the Gordian knot of Italian political life could only be undone by an act of violence. Therefore, I became the public crier of this basic partisan warlike conception. The time had come to shake the souls of men and fire their minds to thinking and acting. It was not long before I was proclaimed the mouthpiece of the intransigent revolutionary socialist faction. I was only 29 years old when at Reggio Emilia at the Congress in 1912, 2 years before the World War began, I was nominated as director of Avanti. It was the only daily of the socialist cause and was published in Milan. I lost my father just before I left for my new office. He was only 57. Nearly 40 of those years had been spent in politics. His was a rectangular mind, a wise spirit, a generous heart. He had looked into the eyes of the first internationalist agitators and philosophers. He had been in prison for his ideas. The Romagna, that part of Italy from which we all came, a spirited district with traditions of a struggle for freedom against foreign oppressions, knew my father's merit. He wrestled year in and year out with endless difficulties, and he had lost the small family patrimony by helping friends who had gone beyond their depth in the political struggle. Prestige he had among all those who came into contact with him. The best political men of his day liked him and respected him. He died poor. I believe his foremost desire was to live to see his sons correctly estimated by public opinion. At the end, he understood at last that the old eternal traditional forces such as capital could not be permanently overthrown by a political revolution. He turned his attention at the end toward bettering the souls of individuals. He wanted to make mankind true of heart and sensitive to fraternity. Many were the speeches and articles about him after his death. 3,000 of the men and women he had known followed his body to the grave. My father's death marked the end of family unity for us, the family. Chapter 3. The Book of Life. I plunged forward into big politics when I settled in Milan at the head of the Avanti. My brother Arnaldo went on with his technical studies, and my sister Edvige, having the offer of an excellent marriage, went to live with her husband in a little place in Romagna called Premilicuore. Each one of us took up for himself the torn threads of the family. We were separated, but in touch. We did not reunite again, however, until August 1914, when we met to discuss politics and war. War had come. War, that female of dreads and fascinations. Up till then, I had worked hard to build up the circulation, the influence, and the prestige of the Avanti. After some months, the circulation had increased to more than 100,000. I then had a dominant situation in the party, but I can say that I did not yield an inch to demagoguery. I have never flattered the crowd, nor wheedled anyone. I spoke always of the costs of victories, sacrifice and sweat and blood. I was living most modestly with my family, with my wife Rachele, wise and excellent woman who has followed me with patience and devotion across all the wide vicissitudes of my life. My daughter, Edda, was then the joy of our home. We had nothing to want. I saw myself in the midst of a fierce struggle, but my family did represent, and always has represented, to me, an oasis of security and refreshing calm. Those years before the World War were filled by political twists and turns. Italian life was not easy. Difficulties were many for the people. The conquest of Tripolitania had exacted its toll of lives and money in a measure far beyond our expectation. Our lack of political understanding brought at least one riot a week. During one ministry of Giolitti, I remember 33. They had their harvest of killed and wounded, and of corroding bitterness of heart. Riots and upheavals among day laborers, among the peasants in the valley of the Po, riots in the south, even separatist movements on our islands. And in the meantime, above all this atrophy of normal life, there went on the tournament and joust of political parties struggling for power. I thought then, as I think now, that only the common denominator of a great sacrifice of blood could have restored to all the Italian nation an equalization of rights and duties. The attempt at revolution, the Red Week, was not revolution as much as it was chaos. No leaders. No means to go on. The middle class and the bourgeoisie gave us another picture of their insipid spirit. We were in June then, picking over our own affairs with a microscope. Suddenly, the murder of Sarajevo came from the blue. In July, the war. Up till that event, my progress had been somewhat diverse. My growth of capacity somewhat varied. In looking back, one has to weigh the effect upon one of various influences commonly supposed powerful. It is a general conviction that good or bad friends can decisively alter the course of a personality. Perhaps it may be true for those fundamentally weak in spirit whose rudders are always in the hands of other steersmen. During my life, I believe neither my school friends, my war friends, nor my political friends ever had the slightest influence upon me. I have listened always with intense interest to their words, their suggestions, and sometimes to their advice, but I am sure that whenever I took an extreme decision, I have obeyed only the firm commandment of will and conscience which came from within. I do not believe in the supposed influence of books. I do not believe in the influence which comes from perusing the books about the lives and characters of men. For myself, I have only used one big book. For myself, I have had only one great teacher. The book is life, lived. The teacher is day-by-day experience. The reality of experience is far more eloquent than all the theories and philosophies on all the tongues and on all the shelves. I have never with closed eyes accepted the thoughts of others when they were estimating events and realities either in the normal course of things or when the situation appeared exceptional. I have searched, to be sure, with a spirit of analysis, the whole ancient and modern history of my country. I have drawn parallels because I wanted to explore to the depths, on the basis of historical fact, the profound sources of our national life and of our character, and to compare our capacities with those of other people. For my supreme aim, I have had the public interest. If I spoke of life, I did not speak of a concept of my own life, my family life, or that of my friends. I spoke and thought and conceived of the whole Italian life taken as a synthesis, as an expression of a whole people. I do not wish to be misunderstood, for I give a definite value to friendship. But it is more for sentimental reasons than for any logical necessity, either in the realm of politics or that of reasoning and logic. I, perhaps more than most men, remember my school friends. I have followed their various careers. I keep in my memory all of my war friends and teachers and superiors and assistants. It makes little difference whether these friendships were with some commanding officers or with typical workers of our soil. On my soldier friends, the life of trench warfare, hard and fascinating, has left, as it has upon me, a profound effect. Great friendships are not perfected on school benches nor in public assemblies, only in front of the magnitude and suggestiveness of danger, only after having lived together in the anxieties and torments of war, can one weigh the soundness of a friendship or measure in advance how long it is destined to go on. In politics, Italian life has had a rather short panorama of men. All know one another. I have not forgotten those who in other days were my companions in the socialist struggle. Their friendship remains, provided they on their part acknowledge the need to make amends for many errors, and provided they have been able to understand that my political evolution has been the product of a constant expansion, of a flow from springs always nearer to the realities of life and always further away from the rigid structures of sociological theorists. My fascist friends live always in my thoughts. I believe the younger ones have a special place there. The organization of fascism was marked and stamped with youth. It has youth's spirit, and it gathered youth, which, like a young orchard, has many years of productiveness for the future. Though it appears that the obligations of governing increase around me every day, I never forget those who were with me, the generous and wise builders, the unselfish and faithful collaborators, the devoted soldiers of a new fascist Italy. I follow step by step their personal and public fortunes. Some minds appear curious as to what territories my reading has explored. I have never attached my name or my mind to a certain school, and as I have already said, I never believed that books were absolute and sure viaticums of life. I have read the Italian authors, old and new, thinkers, politicians, artists. I have always been attracted by the study of our Renaissance in all its aspects. The 19th century, with its artistic and spiritual contrasts, classicism and romanticism and their contrasts, has held my attention. I have studied thoroughly the period of our history called Risorgimento in its moral and political essence. I have analyzed with great care all the development of our intellectual life from 1870 up to this moment. These studies have occupied the most serene hours of my day. Among foreign writers, I have meditated much upon the work of the German thinkers. I have admired the French. One of the books that interested me the most was The Psychology of the Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. The intellectual life of the Anglo-Saxons interested me, especially because of the organized character of its culture and its scholastic taste and flavor. But all that I have read and am reading is only a picture that is unfolded before my eyes without giving me an impression strong enough to make an incision in me. I draw out only the cardinal points that give me above all, and first of all, the necessary elements for the comparison of the essence of different nations. I am desperately Italian. I believe in the function of Latinity. I came to these conclusions after and through a critical study of the German, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavonic history, and that of the world. Nor have I, for obvious reasons, neglected the history of the other continents. The American people, by their sure and active creative lines of life, have touched and touch my sensibility. For I am a man of government and of party. I endlessly admire those who make out of creative work a law of life, and those who win with the ability of their genius, and not with the intrigue of their eloquence. I am for those who seek to make technic perfect in order to dominate the elements and give to men more sure footings for the future. I do not respect, I even hate, those men that leech a tenth of the riches produced by others. The American nation is a creative nation, sane, with straight-lined ideas. When I talk with men of the United States, it does not occur to me to use diplomacy for winning or persuading them. The American spirit is crystalline. One has to know how to take it and possibly win it over with a watchful responsiveness rather than with cunning words. As the reserves of wealth are gone now from the continents to North America, it is right that a large part of the attention of the world should be concentrated upon the activity of this nation that has men of great value, economists of real wisdom, and a new culture. I admire the discipline of the American people and their sense of organization. Certainly, every nation has its periods. The United States is now in the golden age. It is necessary to study these tendencies and their results. And this is not only in the interest of America, but in the interest of the world. America, a land harboring so many of our immigrants, still calls to the spirit of new youth. I look to her youth for her destinies and the preservation of her growing ideals, just as I look to the youth of Italy for the progress of the fascist state. It is not easy to remember always the importance of youth. It is not easy to retain the spirit of youth. It was fortunate for me that in the trenches of Carso, one of the bloodiest and most terrible spots of all the Allied battlefronts, and in the vicissitudes of difficult experiences in the struggle with life, I did not leave my own youth behind. Chapter 4. War and its Effect upon a Man. I write of war and my experience in and with war. I write of popular misconceptions as to war. I write of my convictions as to war, and I write of war from 2 points of view: the politics of the world and the reality of the trenches, where I have been and have learned the torture of pain. It is impossible for me to show my development and feelings from war without showing how my nation entered war, felt war, and accepted war. My psychology was the Italian psychology. I lived it, and I cannot suppress it. It was nonsense to believe that war came unheralded and as a new experience. The European War, which suddenly burst out in 1914 during a period of apparent economic and moral peacefulness, was not a sudden return to barbarism as many optimistic socialists and believers in democracy wished, and still to this day wish people to believe. One must not forget that in 1904 and 1905, Russia fought with Japan a long, disastrous, and exhausting war. In 1911, there was the Libyan War. In 1912 and 1913, two Balkan wars had kept the awakened attention of Europe on the destinies of these nations. These wars had in them the characteristics of an extraordinary drama, as in the incident of Lüleburgaz and in the siege of Adrianople. The real truth of the matter was that an intense spirit of war was all over Europe, in the air, and everybody breathed it. It was the imponderable. We were at the dawn of a new tragic period in the history of mankind. The beginning of that hard historic event, the World War, was at hand. The gigantic development drew in peoples and continents. It compelled tens of millions of men to live in the trenches, to fight inch by inch for years over the bloody theater of a tragic conflict. Millions of dead and wounded, victories and defeats, complex interests, moral or immoral, spirit of resentment and hate, bonds of friendship and disillusionments. All that chaotic and passionate world which lived and made the Great War was part of a cyclopic ensemble, which is difficult to grasp, to define, to circumscribe in mere autobiographic memoirs like these. When one thinks that Germany alone has already published on the war 60 official books and considers many that the other nations have published or will publish, one may lose himself in the labyrinth of speculative thoughts. This tremendous chaos gave birth, among the defeated nations, to the dissolving intellectual skepticism from which sprang the philosophy of realities. Therefore, I proceed by impression, by remembrances. I force my memory to build up in a logical line running parallel to my thoughts and actions the rich picture and the innumerable interlocking events which took place in the most tortured period that humanity ever knew. I was intimately entwined with it. The tragedy of Sarajevo, the murder of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife, created a panic in the public opinion of the whole of Europe. Remember that I was then editor of an internationalist socialist daily. That which wounded the sensitiveness of the various nations was the lightning rapidity of the tragedy. I could see the mathematical efficiency of the organizations which made possible the plans and success of the murder in spite of all the exceptional precautions taken by the police of Austria-Hungary. I realized that Europe was in sympathy with the restlessness of Serbia against the old Habsburg monarchy. After the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina by Austria, that region never had a minute's peace. The Serbian mentality, which worked and still does itself along the subterranean tunnels of secret societies, gave from time to time unpleasant surprises to Austria-Hungary, and the large empire was suffering from it. But no more than a thoroughbred is disturbed by flies. The tragedy of Sarajevo, however, appeared to me to be the last straw. Everyone understood that Austria would act. Strong measures. All the embassies, all the different political parties of Europe realized the gravity of the case and its terrible consequences. They went feverishly to work to find a possible solution, and we looked on. In Italy, the echo of the murder of Sarajevo aroused only curiosity and a thirst for more news. Even when the corpses of the Archduke and his wife were taken into the Gulf of Trieste, which was lighted up the whole night with tremendous torches, the impression on Italians, even though still under Austrian rule, was no deeper than it would have been in the presence of a spectacular epilogue of theatrical tragedy. Francis Ferdinand was an enemy of Italy. I thought that he always underestimated our race. He was not able to sense the heart-throbs of the people of Italian blood still under his flag. He could not weigh the power of race consciousness. He was cherishing the dream of a monarchy melting three races together. Races I knew are difficult to melt. Francis Ferdinand enjoyed the display of his antipathy toward Italy. He took interest in the affairs of Italy only to seek a possible solution for the question of the temporal power of the Pope. It was said that in the secrecy of his court and among his religious advisors, he contemplated the creation of a papal city in Rome with an outlet on the sea. Though deeply a Catholic like myself, he accepted of Christianity only the hard, familiar, autocratic ideals which were the base of the old despotism, forming the platform of autocratic government, but were incapable of speaking to souls. In psychological makeup, this small, snarling archduke believed himself to be specially anointed by God to rule over subjects. He put fear in the hearts of smaller nations bordering his domain. His death gave me surprise. It gave no sadness to us. For obvious reasons, the pathetic end of the Archduchess created feelings of a more sympathetic nature. We Italians are responsive, sympathetic. The telegram of the Kaiser to the bereaved children fed the already dramatic tune and tempo of our impressions. I saw that Germany intended steadfastly to stand back of Austria for whatever action this nation was going to take towards Serbia. It was thought that Vienna would make a formal protest to Belgrade, but no one anticipated an ultimatum of such deadliness as fatally to wound the sensibility and the honor, as well as the very freedom of that nation. All these currents I had to watch as the young editor of the Avanti. The dictatorial form of the ultimatum, the style in which it was written, brought home to the world the shocking realization that war hung in the sky. We in Italy had to ask whether internationalism was having a success or whether it was an unreality. I wondered and reached a conclusion. Embassies went feverishly to work. The political parties added the pressure of their weight to the diplomatic activities. The call to arms and the clamor of gathering armies put into second line the theoretical protests of socialist and international forces. All of us in Italy who faced hard facts, rather than mouthy theories, heard the call of our country, a call of loneliness. Illusions burst like bubbles. Even the convention of French and German socialists and the murder of Jaurès in Paris were but secondary episodes. To me, they appeared as fringes of the mighty and dramatic conflict toward which, day by day, the various nations were being drawn by destiny. I must not forget that a few months previous to the Great War, I had heard and noted a voice raised in the French Parliament, painting with pessimistic colors the inefficiency of the French army, both from the viewpoint of economic war and the lack of modern means of defense and defense. Clemenceau, foaming at the mouth, was present at this discussion. He said afterward that never in his career as a politician since 1871 had he witnessed a more dramatic seance than this one in which the French nation was compelled fully to realize the insufficiency of its army, lacking the very means needed for a great conflict. That was a lesson. We do not forget it. War was ripe. The tardy and weak intervention, both known and secret, of the Pope and of the benevolent nations outside the circle of the Allies had no weight. They could not stop the procession of events. War began the 1st of August, 1914. It was the full bloom of summer. Under the deep shadow of the cloud, the people of old Europe stood in awe, but fascinated as one is fascinated by a snake. Italy, a few years previously, had renewed the Triple Alliance Treaty. It had been a marriage without respect and without trust, brought about more in order to counterbalance military power than by political necessity. There is small difference between security and military alliance. The alliance with Austria and Germany gave, however, to Italy a certain latitude and a certain freedom of movement. The Marchese of San Giuliano, who was at the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Faced by the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia and by the scheming to bring about war at all costs, had to play fast to keep Italy neutral. As a matter of fact, the treaty called only for action if one or more of the nations of the Triple Alliance was assaulted by a nation outside that alliance. We were kept in the dark, as I well knew. That was enough to break the pact, to free us from further obligations to that alliance. One of the first courageous actions in which Italy showed the measure of her independence and strength was recognition of this. Meanwhile, the intervention of Russia in behalf of Serbia called also France against Germany, the ally of Austria-Hungary. I watched England. She was pondering deeply on the step to take, and then, in order to keep her supremacy and also for the sake of her pride and the sake of humanity, she moved her formidable war machinery and quickened the organization of new armies to snatch from Germany's grip the control of the old continent. Public opinion in Italy was deeply moved, facing war, with its German invasion of East France. There was the description with horrid details of German methods, and above all the invasion of Belgium in spite of every sense of right and humanity. The French army was helplessly forced back. The future, not of one nation but of many nations, was in the scale. Of this, in my editorial office, I was always conscious. There was also the feeling of a common culture which was compelling us to forget past and present quarrels. I could not bear the idea that my country might abandon those who were crushed under the weight of war and unwarranted misfortune. Germany began to influence Italian public opinion with methods of propaganda that irritated the sensitiveness of our race. That enraged me. To direct this propaganda, a great diplomat, Prince von Bülow, who knew the Italian and Roman world intimately, was sent. His aim in Italy was to ensure its neutrality for good and all. But our nation was turning toward war. I was helping. The Socialist Party, which at the time had a certain weight in Italian life due more to the weakness of other political parties than to its own strength, was uncertain which attitude to take. There it wobbled. The majority in that party stood for an absolute neutrality, a neutrality without limit of time, pledge, or dignity. In that party, there were many who stood openly in sympathy with Germany. I did not. A handful of intelligent and strong-willed men began to ask themselves if it was really right for Italians to lend themselves to the political aims of the King of Prussia, and if that was good for the future of Italy and of the world. I myself asked that question in the newspaper Avanti. For obvious reasons, it was read avidly by every class of citizens. The putting of that question was my most distinguished effort at journalism. It was sufficient to cause a part of public opinion to turn toward the possibility of our standing side by side with France and England in the war. We could not and should not forget that there were certain sentimental reasons, besides the practical reasons, advising us to review in this general conflict the old decision concerning our eastern border, which had remained open since our war with Austria in 1886. At night, I walked to my family, to my home, with pregnant questions in my mind, with deepening determination, with hardening resolution. Above all, there was my own country. I saw that internationalism was crumbling. The unit of loyalty was too large. I wrote an editorial in which I said how utterly foolish was the idea that even if a socialist state was created, the old barriers of race and historical contentions would not go on causing wars. Italy's borders on the eastern side reached the Giudrio, but the region of Trentino, illegally held by Austria, entered as a wedge between Lombardy and the Venetian provinces. Our deal with the Empire of Austria-Hungary was still to be closed because the borders prophesied by Dante were dear to every Italian heart. They were and always would be along the line of the Brenner and of the Julian and Illyrian Alps, including Fiume and Dalmatia. Facing this new situation, every political man, including myself, began to examine his conscience. The mere mention of this problem was sufficient to make clear and evident the hidden travail of national consciousness. I was transformed in my thought. Now or never. was the war cry of Cesare Battisti, whose noble spirit and final martyrdom by Austrian execution has made him immortal in Italian hearts. Then there was the prophetic vision of that fiery revolutionary spirit, Filippo Corridoni. With their inspiration, I began to drag with me a fraction of the socialists in favor of war. I had with me rebels of many schools who, through the dregs of their struggles, would in the end now stand once more upon the indestructible vitality of our race. The socialist Synedrium, seeing where I was going, took the Avanti out of my control. I could no longer preach by that means intervention of Italy in the war. I faced the socialists in our conventions. I was expelled. I held public gatherings. I created the Fascisti, a group of daring youths who believed that intervention could be forced. Do not doubt that their actions shook deeply our political framework, existing from the time of the independence of Italy up till 1914. I was their leader. It is interesting today, when democracy is challenged, to recall that the Liberal Democratic Pacifist group, headed by Giovanni Giolitti, a man of great influence in Parliament and also a shrewd organizer of political schemes, was busy in the attempt to find a formula which would solve the problem of righting the borders of Italy, but would save our country from the burden, the sacrifice, and the loss of life that every war imposes. Giolitti promised that even without war, Italy could obtain a great deal. This great deal awakened a feeling of sarcasm in the generous hearts of Italians. Naturally, they are realists and enemies of all forms of political bargaining. Italians were looking beyond those peaceful concessions and those petty betterings of the borders. They did not believe in the sincerity of this scheming. I considered it weak statesmanship, the statesmanship of promise. There were seers who saw in the European conflict not only national advantages, but the possibility of a supremacy of race. In the cycle of time, again, a dramatic period had come which was making it possible for Italy, by weight of its army, to deal as an equal with the leading nations of the world. That was our chance. I wanted to seize it. It became my one thought of intensity. The World War began on July 28, 1914. Within 60 days, I severed my official connection with the Socialist Party. I had already ceased to be editor of the Avanti. I felt lighter, fresher. I was free. I was better prepared to fight my battles than when I was bound by the dogmas of any political organization. But I understood that I could not use with efficient strength my convictions if I was without that modern weapon, capable of all possibilities, ready to arm and help, good for offense and defense, the newspaper. I needed a daily paper. I hungered for one. I gathered together a few of my political friends who had followed me in the last hard struggle, and we held a war council. When money alone is concerned, I am anything but a wizard. When it is a question of means or of capital to start a project or how to finance a newspaper, I grasp only the abstract side, the political value, the spiritual essence of the thing. To me, money is detestable. What it may do is sometimes beautiful and sometimes noble. A few friends bristling with ideas and ardent with faith almost immediately found small rooms, garret-like, in the narrow street of Paolo da Canobbio, near the Piazza del Duomo in Milan. Nearby, there was a printing establishment. Its owner agreed to publish our newspaper at a small cost. I was mad to tell Italy and Italians the truth, their opportunity. We had no need for great means. We wanted a newspaper that would hold the city of Milan like a fortress, with editorial articles of such value that they would be reprinted or quoted by every Italian newspaper. Thus, and how dramatically, the number of our readers would be multiplied. That was my passion. Our offices were quickly furnished with a desk and a few chairs. I can never cease to have affection for that intellectual dugout, the journalistic trenches from which I began to fight. A contract was signed with the printing establishment. A contract that every week was in danger of smashing for the lack of the few thousand lire needed to pay our weekly expense. But we were living on an idea. On November 15th, 1914, the first number of the Popolo d'Italia appeared. Even now I call this new paper my most cherished child. It was only through it, small as was its beginning, that I was able to win all the battles of my political life. I am still its director. I could write, and may write, 1,000 memories of this newspaper, which was born in 1914 and remained my platform up to 1922. It was an instrument for the making of me. The name of the Popolo d'Italia will occur over and over again. Its story may, in any case, be told through my personality as a political man, as a newspaper man, as a believer in this war, as a soldier, as an Italian, and as a fascist. My first article in the Popolo d'Italia turned a large part of public opinion toward the intervention of Italy in the war, side by side with France and England. Standing by me and helping my work as newspaper man were the fascisti. They were composed of revolutionary spirits who believed in intervention. They were youths, the students of the universities, the socialist syndicalists, destroying faith in Karl Marx by their ideals. They were professional men, too, and the working men who could still hear the real voice of the country. And now, while Italy remained out of the war, our first legions of volunteers were organized and went to France to fight. In the Argonne fell the two sons of Ricciotti Garibaldi, Bruno and Costante, nephews of the great Garibaldi, who conquered North Sicily and Naples for united Italy. The funeral of those two heroes took place in Rome and had solemn echoes all over Italy. Again, the red shirts, once distinguished as the saviors of Italy, now in the land of France, testified to the indestructibility of Latinity. The past quarrels, not long past, of Mediterranean interests were wiped out. The hostilities of the French during the time of our war in Libya were put aside. No one remembered the episode of the French ships Manuba and Carthage, which brought help to the Turks, who were fighting against us in January 1912. Everything was off. France was in danger, assaulted, and invaded after the tragic rape of Belgium. This I preached and set forth. France was in danger. Gabriele D'Annunzio, on the 5th of May, made his speech at Quarto dei Mille, near Genoa. Quarto dei Mille was the starting point of Garibaldi and his 1,000 northerners and other patriots who went down to Sicily to deliver southern Italy from the yoke of the Bourbons. He, with superb eloquence, exhorted Italy to enter the war. The spirit of the country was tuned up. The opposition of Giolitti brought about a quick decision. The Crown, bounded by parliamentary formulas and by the advice of its councillors, wanting to follow strictly the literal and orthodox interpretation of the Constitution, told the personal representative of the Kaiser that Italy, as an old ally, had been kept in the dark and thus betrayed. The insurrection in Milan in favor of war, the strong feelings of the same flavor in Rome, Padua, Genoa, and Naples decided His Majesty Victor Emmanuel III to exclude Giovanni Giolitti and to reconfide to Salandra, who had tendered his resignation, the task of reconstituting a new ministry. I felt that I had a part in winning this battle. Still a young, unproved man, I had already a record of untrammeled freedom and power. The new ministry spelled war. Thrown aside was the great deal of His Excellency Giolitti. The question now was to choose the right moment and the right way to jump into the war. We were breathing hard. Our hearts were ready. We were awaiting the great hour. It came May 24th, 1915. Can anyone say what were my emotions at this moment of triumph? I cannot try to narrate in one chapter all the events of the war on the Italian front. It is impossible. The war molded me. I was forced into its dramatic unfolding in the circumscribed viewpoint of a mere soldier of the war. I will tell you what touched me most as a soldier and indirectly as a political man. I made up my mind to be the best soldier possible from the very day that I wore again the glorious uniform of grey-green of the regiment of Bersaglieri, the best shock troops of Italy, in which regiment I had already served during the time of my compulsory military service. I wanted to be a soldier, obedient, faithful to discipline, stretching myself with all my might to the fulfillment of my duty. In this, I felt that I succeeded. My political position brought me plenty of offers of privileges and sheltered places. I turned them down. I wanted to create the impression of a complete and rigid consistence with an ideal. This was not a scheming on my part for personal gain. It was a deep need in my nature of what I believed and still hold on to as my life's dedication, namely, that once a man sets up to be the expounder of an idea or of a new school of thought, he must consistently and intensively live the daily life and fight the battles for the doctrines that he teaches at any cost until victory, to the end. Time has effaced many things. The easy spirit of forgetfulness has erased so much. Victory, which came after 41 months of hard fighting, has awakened many deep resentments. As soon as war was declared, as I have said, I asked the military authorities to accept my services as a volunteer. They answered that I could not be a volunteer. That was a tragedy. They said that they refused on the ground that an article of the military bylaws considered as possible volunteers only those who had been rejected for physical unfitness, or were exonerated for other reasons from compulsory military service. I could not be accepted as a volunteer. I was to wait my turn to be called to arms until the order from my superiors should be sent me. I was disconsolate. Happily, my turn came quickly. On September 1st, only 3 months after Italy declared war, I donned the simple uniform of a private bersagliere. I was sent to Brescia in Lombardy, not far from the raids of airplanes, to drill. Almost at once, I was, to my great relief, dispatched to the thick of the fighting on the high Alps. For a few months I underwent the hardest trials of my life in mountain trenches. We still had nothing to soften our hardships in the trenches or in the barracks. We were simply stumbling along, short of everything, carrying on, muddling through. What we suffered the first months, cold, rain, mud, hunger, they did not succeed in dampening the slightest degree my enthusiasm and my conviction as to the necessity and the inevitableness of war. They did not change the direction of one hair of my head, one thought in it. I was chosen to be the amanuensis of headquarters. That I refused. I refused flatly. I amused myself instead by joining the most dangerous reconnoitering expeditions. It was my will and my wish. I gained through that. Within a few months, I was promoted corporal by merit of war action with a citation from my superior in these words: Benito Mussolini, ever the first in operations of courage and audacity. My political past, with the suspicions of cautious and sometimes unseeing authorities, still followed me. It was enough to keep my superiors from sending me to the training school for officers at Vernezzo. After 1 week of leave, I went back to the trenches, where I remained for months. The same life, feverish, adventurous, desperate, and then typhoid fever sent me to the military hospital at Cividale. When I was better, I was packed off to Ferrara for a brief, stupid period of convalescence. From there I again took my place on the high pinnacles of the Alps, where, at night, one looking into the dark sky with its shimmering stars felt nearer to the great dome above. My battalion was ordered to an advance post on the Carso, Section 144, to take up the offensive. I was then made one of the company of soldiers who had specialized in hand grenades. We lived only a few dozen yards from the enemy in a perpetual and, it sometimes seemed, an eternal atmosphere of shell fire and mortal danger that would be our life forever. After this first period of hardship, I became perfectly and almost comfortably accustomed to all the terrible elements that life in the trenches involves. I read with hungry eagerness the Popolo d'Italia, my newspaper. I had left it in the hands of a few friends, precipitously separated from it as one leaves suddenly a beloved relative. I had given orders to keep alight the lamp of Italy's duty and destiny. I commanded, "Continue always to call for war to the end." I wrote often to my friends. Never did I let myself indulge in writing all my true feelings and opinions because I was first of all a soldier, obeying. I found my recreation in the trenches, studying the psychology of officers and troops. Later on, that practice and observation became invaluable to me. In my rough heart, I held a persistent admiration for the soldiers from all corners of Italy. Many ordered to the Eastern Front were not convinced of the historical basis for the war, yet they knew how to obey their commanding officers with admirable discipline. Many of those officers were students of the colleges and universities. It was fine to see them striving to emulate the regulars and to prove that the old-time valor was still alive in the new Italian generation. The fact was that war, with its heavy toll of man and materials, and with its terrific hardships, surprised us. It was far away from our Garibaldian conception of what war was. We were compelled in breakneck haste to modify our ideas, to change our systems of fighting and our methods of offense and defense. My heart was gladdened to see that the capacity for adaptability of our race brought marvelous and quick returns. The headquarters and all the auxiliary military organizations, particularly the medical, worked with a precision which I never have forgotten. But often, as I went over the political situation back of our armies, dark doubts were in my mind. The work and actions of the men in power, and of the political organizations centered in Rome, caused me deep fears. The parliamentary world seemed unable to free itself from its old faults. The poisonous currents of non-intervention and neutrality were still spending their last strength upon us. They would not fairly face their defeat. I knew they were doing their utmost to minimize the energy and elasticity of our fighting efforts. The foolish babblings and fears of the coffeehouse strategists and slackers whose presence offended the families whose sons were in the war contributed to depress the spirit of resistance. As a plain soldier, I could not understand how, for instance, Romania could be dragged into the war with a few hundred machine guns. How could Greece be persuaded to march against the Turks influenced by a classic dance that Isadora Duncan performed at the Piraeus? I was following, day by day, the movement of our army, the Battle of the Isonzo in 1916, the fights on the Alps. With less interest, I followed the fortunes of war in France, the unfortunate failure at the Dardanelles, and the developments in the eastern section. As for Italy, never for a minute did I doubt that victory would finally come to us. Though war were to last longer than the longest estimate, though our economic power might totter under the effort and weight of the conflict, nevertheless, I was sure of a final victory. The Italian army in its various actions was led by a method of successive assaults to shake the efficiency of the enemy. In spite of all the hardship, discipline remained intact throughout our lines. The invasion attempted on the plateaus of the Alps in 1916 was soon thrown back. The soldiers of the Carso, where I was, had all the appearance of seasoned veterans. In such a gigantic drama, when thousands of our brothers fell, it is absurd to speak of oneself. However, to prove once more what miseries were woven into the Italian life of politics, I was compelled from time to time to give out in the newspapers news concerning myself. This was in order to smash the suspicions of those persons who thought me hidden in some office, distributing mail and entertaining in my mind doubts of the possibility of our winning the war. I was compelled to offset this slander and to state over and over what I had done and what I was doing. I was then Major Corporal of the Bersaglieri, and I had been in the front-line trenches from the beginning of the war up to February 1917, always facing the enemy without my faith being shaken or my convictions wavering an inch. From time to time, I sent articles to the Popolo d'Italia exhorting to endless resistance. I pleaded for unshaken faith in final victory. For reasons of military discipline, I used a nom de plume. Thus, I found myself fighting in two ways, against the enemy without and in front of me, and against the enemy of weak spirit within and behind me. On the morning of February 22nd, 1917, during a bombardment of the enemy trenches in Sector 144, the sector of the hard-pressed Carso, under the heaviest shell fire, there happened one of those incidents which was a daily occurrence in trench life. One of our own grenades burst in our trench among about 20 of us soldiers. We were covered with dirt and smoke and torn by metal. 4 died. Various others were fatally wounded. I was rushed to the hospital at Ronchi, a few miles from the enemy trenches. Dr. Picagnoni and other surgeons took care of me with the greatest zeal. My wounds were serious. The patience and ability of the physicians succeeded in taking out of my body 44 pieces of the grenade. Flesh was torn, bones broken. I faced atrocious pain. My suffering was indescribable. I underwent practically all my operations without the aid of an anesthetic. I had 27 operations in 1 month. All except 2 were without anesthetics. This infernal life of pain lasted until a furious bombardment burst into pieces 1 wing and a part of the central building of my hospital at Ronchi. All the wounded were rushed to a faraway refuge, but my condition would not permit my removal. Unable to move, I remained for days under the intermittent fire of the enemy guns among the dirty, jagged ruins of the building. I was absolutely defenseless. In spite of all, my wounds began to heal. Better days and relief came. I received numberless telegrams of solicitude, and once His Majesty the King called. His warm sense of humanity toward all soldiers and toward the victims of the war will never be forgotten by me or by Italy. After some months, I found myself in a war hospital in Milan. In August, I began to walk with crutches, on which I swung about for many months. My limbs were too weak to support my weight. I took my place as a fighter in my newspaper office. The acute situation created by the incredible and inconceivable failure of the Russian front was putting upon us new duties. It was necessary to face them. To all this there was added a subtle propaganda in the land. That despicable poison had as a slogan the vile sentence of a socialist member of parliament. We will desert the trenches before the winter comes. There was need to fight to a finish these mysterious forces which were playing upon the sentiments and sufferings of the people. Soldiers, after a fortnight's furlough, were returning to the trenches in a sullen frame of mind. Life in the cities had all the characteristics of revelry. It was the psychological moment in which it was necessary to have the people feel highly the strength of authority. It was necessary that the government should stand up in its shoes. I do not wish to make posthumous recriminations. The weakness of internal politics in 1917, the feeble parliamentary situation, the hateful socialistic propaganda were certainly preparing the ground for events that could prove to be ruinous. And the blow came in October 1917. It took the name of Caporetto. Never in my life as an Italian and as a politician have I experienced a sorrow equal to that which I suffered after the news of the defeat of Caporetto. This episode, compared with the other defeats in the various theaters of the Great War, certainly did not have an exceptional importance, but it was a terrific blow for Italians. This sudden breaking down of our front let a wedge of the enemy army penetrate into the high valley of the Isonzo. In the first rush of the war, we had gone over the borders into Old Austria, carrying on our warfare on enemy ground. We had withstood in 1916 the attack on the Alps of Asiago. We had conquered in the plateau of Bainsizza. We had been 10 times victorious on the Isonzo. Our sensitiveness and tormented souls were now shaken to the depths. The moment was fearful. The Third Army, surrounded on the other side of the Isonzo, must be saved. It was imperative to stand at all costs on the Piave and to resist like stone on Mount Grappa to save the north of the Venetian provinces from being cut off from the rest of Italy. The rally of the army, followed by quick action, took place in almost no time. On Mount Grappa, the army of iron withstood. On Piave, the enemy could not pass by. A new strength entered into play. One could feel it coming. A new spirit of war took its unfaltering stand. Once more we saw the enemy face to face. After losing Gorizia and 2 provinces, Belluno and Udine, we were deeply wounded, and we lived dramatic moments which seared my heart. But we may now be sure that Italy did not go through the tragic hours that many armies and other countries underwent. Compare with our disaster the general picture of the Great War, the loss of 3 provinces with the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the invasion of Königsberg, the 14 invaded departments of France, and the flooding of Belgium. I am proud that during that year of desperate moments, my paper gave a higher note to the political life of the country. We raised the fighting spirit of the soldiers. Helped by the mutilated, the wounded, and the pro-war veterans, I began an active campaign of stand to a finish. With fiery style, I demanded on the part of the central government severe action against slackers and whosoever undermined the spirit of war. I called for the organization of a volunteer army. I asked for military rule in the north of Italy. I insisted on the suppression of socialist newspapers. I asked for a more humane treatment of the soldiers. I campaigned for war discipline, first behind us and all over the land, then at the front. This campaign developed by degrees in the newspaper, then in public meetings, in gatherings at the front. It brought results far beyond my highest hopes. The government seemed to be tugged after us by our efforts toward resistance and victory. Thus the winter went by. With the coming of the spring, the whole Italian population stretched out their energies toward the front on the Piave and that on the Grappa. At last, a spirit of national solidarity, deep and alive, had become the common property both of the soldiers and of their families. A high spirit of duty and sacrifice was the rule of life in our Italy. We were ready in 1918 on the Piave with a heroic army. The Arditi, the first shock troops, composed of volunteers who went over the top with hand grenades and daggers, was giving a unique dramatic appeal to our aggressive spirit. In every one there was the deep desire to efface the memory of the days of Caporetto. We were to go back to where our brothers, dead and alive, were waiting for us. The remembrance of our dead, above all, was calling to us. Surely the wish of our adversaries to cross the Piave could never be. It was an idle hope to be met and crushed by our own offensive. Aviation continued to give service of reconnoitering and bombardment. I could feel the soul of Italy stretching toward victory. Necessity had sharpened the more brilliant minds. June came, and with it, the dawn of the enemy's attack. Our Secret Service succeeded in learning exactly the time that the enemy would start his drive. Following sound war strategy, our Supreme Command decided to surprise the enemy. And just a few hours before the enemy was ready to move, a deluge of every description fell on his front lines as well as the supporting lines behind. His plans were smashed. He threw bridges across the Piave, but every one was destroyed. The Montello, which was once the key of that front, and which the enemy intended to take and use as a pincher against our army, we held with dogged tenacity. There were oscillations for a few miles, but the battle raged on without a stop. Our counterattacks came back always, again and again and again. Thus, after the first 3 days, the enemy felt that this time the Italians were like an unbreakable wall, which they could not scale or batter down. Near Censon, the adversaries succeeded in crossing the river as far as Monastir of Treviso, but a rapid counterattack of a few of our brigades threw him back on the Piave again. It turned into a disaster for the enemy as the river, flooded, washed away bridges and soldiers toward the sea. On the 23rd of June, 5 days after the beginning of the big battle, our Supreme Command assured Italy that our resistance was bound to hold. I felt that it was a sure sign that victory was at hand. I believe to this day that the Battle of the Piave was one of the most decisive of the whole World War. The enemy suffered loss beyond reckoning. About 100,000 Hungarians were sacrificed on the Piave. That brought about deep resentment in Budapest. Among the people of the various races in the Austrian Empire, there began discussions about the burdens that each nationality in that empire had to suffer. From them, the enemies, each nationality felt that its treatment was becoming intolerable. News leaked out to us from Austria-Hungary. It was clear that internal difficulties there were growing every moment. The enemy's army, however, was still holding together and, under the goad of necessity, was sharpening the work of oppression on our two provinces, which still remained under the weight of occupation and misfortune. It was at this time, right after the spirit of exhilaration of victory, that I observed strange tendencies in the Italian political world. Evil activity was at hand. It needed to be exposed and suppressed. It was cloaked under the appearance of humanitarianism. It was planning to give a series of national rights to peoples who never had the consciousness and the dignity of nations, to peoples who had been for more than a century instruments of oppressing the Italian elements under Austria, under the instigation of the despotic empire. The sun of our victory was rising, but to be a complete victory, a victory that would carry our soldiers on the road to Vienna, it must not falter through false sentimentality. This crisis was sufficient to inspire many great men still under the influence of antiquated and rusted democratic ideas to start discussions about the problems of racial differences. They always tended to favor our worst enemies. The spirit of our nationalism was attacked and dwarfed by sophisticated and pernicious applications of sentiment, irritating to our deepest feelings and to our most legitimate susceptibilities. Voices of the Italians began to say that every time Italy was on the verge of living its hour of joy, glory, and victory, there were always those who soiled the moment, and this often not in good faith. Summer went by, and in October 1918, our Supreme Command, with 51 Italian divisions, to which were added 3 British, 2 French divisions, 1 American regiment, and a few Czechoslovakian volunteers, determined to make a decisive final drive on the Austrian front. The strategic plan was a very wise one. The enemy's front was pierced at Cernalia. Our enemy rushed through the break. We started a surrounding movement, one on the left toward Trento, and one to the right toward Udine and the lower Piave. The ardent dash of our soldiers and the ability of our officers brought these movements to full success and crumbled to pieces the whole front of the enemy. The War Bulletin states the enormous number of prisoners, guns, and war material that fell into our hands. The army of Austria-Hungary was defeated. Its navy had suffered tremendous losses. We landed at Trieste. We occupied Trento. The final victory was not only a victory of war. I saw more than that. It was a victory for the whole Italian race. After 1,000 years, we, awakened, were again giving a tangible proof of our moral and spiritual valor. We were living again on warlike tradition. Our love of country had bloomed again. We felt our formidable weight in the future of a new Europe. New generations of Italians rejoiced, for the Italian cities were once again rejoined to the country. Trento and Trieste, as our race had wished so long, were now within the borders, the natural borders which Dante had prophesied and defined in the 14th century. In every corner of the land, the church bells rang, saluting the new day. War, so long and so taxing, had ended. It ended with a full, undeniable victory of Italy in spite of the bankruptcy of Russia and the abominable work of slackers and professional destroyers of ideals. For me, every family wore the badge of a dear one, dead or wounded. Widows and orphans of war were proud to show the symbols of sadness and glory. We were in Trento and Trieste. Fiume was half conquered, while Dalmatia was still in the scale. Over Italy reigned almost supreme a spirit of pride and of serenity, typical of those who have won. War lasted longer than we thought, had diminished our wealth, had supposedly reduced to the minimum our future. Victory, however, warmed our hearts and our souls. It exalted Italians and spurred them to higher work, honoring the dead as well as the living. From October to December 1918, Italy seemed like a factory working in full blast, in complete accord with progress. War had left, beyond its inevitable griefs, a deep, poetical vein in our national life. No one sensed it better, no one seemed more a part of it than I. It was in this great historical moment, immediately after a victory achieved with untold hardship, that our young nation, younger as a nation than America, with traditions not yet seasoned by age, in spite of having thrown into the golden brazier of the conflict men and wealth, was treacherously deceived. Its fundamental trustfulness was played upon in the making of the Treaty of Versailles. This is the awful toll that Italy paid in the Great War. 652,000 dead, 450,000 mutilated, 1 million wounded. There is not in our country one single family which during the 41 months of the war had not placed in the Holocaust on the altar of the country a part of itself. I know every day, 10 years later, that the mutilated, the wounded, the widows and orphans of war form a vast proportion of our population, inspiring the respect and homage of the multitude. I will never forget. We have gone through 1,000 phases of internal troubles, from aberrations to a purifying revolution, yet, from Mount Stelvio to the sea, in our mountain cemeteries, which the hand of time slowly effaces, there remains the most powerful citadel of the fortune of our nation and of our people. I never forget. I had been the most tenacious believer in the war. I had fought with all my warm soul of Italian and soldier. I lived the joy of victory. I lived in the midst of the unrest of afterwar. But in every event, happy or sad, I have always had as a touchstone, as a lighthouse, as a source of every advice and of deep wisdom, the memory of the dead. They are from every region and from every walk of life, even those who are under foreign yoke or emigrated to other countries. They gave their blood and were willing to offer the supreme sacrifice for the mother country. Until the time when a nation has the right of sitting with proud head among other nations, the surest sign of its strength, the highest title of its nobility, the vital food needed to reach greatness, will always be given by those who laid down their blood and life for their immortal country. These are the marks that war made upon one's body, one's mind, and one's soul. Above all, it gave to one who was still young an understanding of the essences of mankind. Chapter 5: Ashes and Embers. The flame of war flickered and went out, but the years 1919 and 1920 that immediately followed the end of the war seemed to me the darkest and most painful periods of Italian life. Dark thunderclouds hung over our unity. The progress of Italy's unification was threatened. I watched the gathering storm. Already, disquieting events had menaced our national life. They were due to political happenings even more than to an economic crisis. I point to the movement of the Sicilian Gaze in 1894 and the bloody demonstration in Milan in 1898, but these manifestations of rebellion were localized. Not one of them bore in it the virile germs of disillusion or of separatism. But I assert that the episodes of 1919 and 1920 had in them bacilli, which, if not treated heroically, are deadly for the life of a civilized nation. Everything was discussed again. We Italians opened the box of political problems and took apart the social clockwork. We pawed over everything from the crown to parliament, from the army to our colonies, from capitalistic property to the communistic Soviet proposal for the federation of the regions of Italy, from schools to the papacy. The lovely structure of concord and harmony that we combatants and the wounded had dreamed that we would build after the luminous victory of October 1918 was falling to pieces. The leaves were falling from our tree of idealism. I felt that we were left without any cohesive force, any suggestive heroism, any remembrance, any political philosophy sufficient to overcome and stop the factors of disillusion. I sensed the chills and heats of decay and destruction. Already in January 1919, the socialists, slightly checked during the war, began the moment the ink was drying on the armistice their work of rebellion and blackmail. From Milan, the socialistic municipality sent a special mission of help to the so-called brothers in Vienna. Sickly internationalism put forth its buds in this morbid springtime. At Trieste, the socialist Pittoni played an important part in the reorganization of the delivered city. In many Italian cities, poor children of the old enemy Austrian and Habsburg capital were asked to take precedence. It was a provoking sentimentality. A desire was already clear in the minds of subversives and of liberal Giolitians. It was to strike out of our memories the sense and feeling of our victory. I knew those who whipped up our degeneration. They were German and Austrian spies, Russian agitators, mysterious subventions. In a few months, they had led the Italian people into a state of marasmus. The economic crisis existing in every corner of the world could not be expected to spare Italy. The soldiers, like myself, returning from the war, rushed to their families. Who can describe our feelings? Such an imposing phenomenon as the demobilization of millions of men took place in the dark, without noise, in an atmosphere of throwing discipline to the winds. There were, for us, the troubles of winter and the difficulties of finding new garments and adjustments for peace. We suffered the humiliation of seeing the banners of our glorious regiments return to their homes without being saluted, without that warm cheer of sympathy owed to those who return from victorious war. Now it again appeared to me and to my friends as if there was in everybody an instinct to finish the game of war, not with the idea of real victory, but with content that we had lost as little as possible. Ears and spirits were ready to listen to words of peace, of humanity, of brotherhood between nations. At night, before sleep came, I used to meditate and realize that we had no dam to stop this general decay of faith, this renunciation of the interests and destiny of a victorious nation. The sense of destruction penetrated very quickly and deeply the spirit of all classes. Certainly, the central government was no dike to prevent the flood of weakness. Politicians and philosophers, profiteers and losers, for at least many had lost their illusions, sharks trying to save themselves, promoters of the war trying to be pardoned, demagogues seeking popularity, spies and instigators of trouble waiting for the price of their treason, agents paid by foreign money in a few months threw the nation into an awful spiritual crisis. I saw before me with awe the gathering dusk of our end as a nation and a people. With my heart in tumult and with a deep sense of bitterness corroding my soul, I could smell the danger. Some audacious men were with me, not many. My action was at first tied to the urgent duty to fight against one important and dark treason. Certain Italians, blinded and having lost their memories, were led on by some complicity in selfish desires among the Allies. These Italians were actually setting themselves against the mother country. Dalmatia, Italian in its origin, ardent as a saint in its faith, had been recognized to be ours by the Pact of London. Dalmatia had waited for the victorious war with years of passion, and holding in its bosom still the remains of Venice and Rome, was now lopped off from our unity. The politics of renunciation, helped by foreigners, galloped forward. Wilson was the distiller or supporter of theoretical formulas. He could not comprehend Italian life or history. By his unconscious aid, this treason to us was nourished. Fiume, the sacrificed town, whose people called desperately for Italy in its manifestations in the public squares, who sent pleading missions to our military chiefs, was occupied by corps of international troops. We were about to lose another war trophy, the Austrian Navy. Cesana, 20 kilometers from Trieste, was discussed as a possible frontier. I said then that never in the life of any nation on the day after victory had there been a more odious tragedy than that of this silly renunciation. In the first months of 1919, Italy, led on by politicians like Nitti and Albertini Salvemini, had only one frantic wish that I could see. It was to destroy every grain of victorious struggle. Its only dedication was to a denial of the borders and soil extent of the nation. It forgot our 600,000 dead and our 1 million wounded. It made waste of their generous blood. These leaders wanted to satisfy foreign impulses of doubtful origin and doctrines brewed of poisons. This attempt at matricide of the motherland was abetted by Italians of perverted intellect and by professional socialists. Toward both, later on, the fascist revolution showed so much forbearance that it was more than generosity. I was snatched up in this fight against the returning beast of decadence. I was for our sacred rights to our own territories. Therefore, I had to neglect in a degree the petty internal political life that was floundering in bewilderment and wallowing in disorder. On the international playground, the stake was higher. One had to remain on the field to save what could be saved. As to internal politics, I knew very well that a strong government would quickly put in order the socialists and the anarchists, the decadents and wreckers, and the instigators of disorder. I knew at first hand their soul. It has always been the same at all times, in all ages. It is the spirit of coward wolves and ferocious sheep. And thus one day, a few months after the armistice, I saw at Milan a fact more disquieting and more important than I thought possible. I saw a socialist procession with an endless number of red flags, with 30 bands, with ensigns cursing the war. I saw a river in the street made of women, children, Russians, Germans, and Austrians flowing through the town upward and downward from the popular quarters to those of the center, and finally dispersing at one of the most central points of the town at the amphitheater of the arena. They had had numerous meetings. They clamored for amnesty for the deserters. They demanded the division of the land. Milan was then considered more than now the city where the pulse of the working nation could be felt. Milan, where I had labored with ideals, had experienced in 1914 and in the first months of 1915 epic days for the war. The city always had a strong and gallant spirit. In it, citizenship was more active than in many other parts of the country. It had known how to prepare itself with dignity to sustain war effort. And now, after the triumph, even this town, the town of the 10,000 volunteers, seemed to yield itself to a disease. This procession, I said, was an evidence of the deep mire in which all the classes of the population were sinking, especially those belonging to the popolari. As the procession passed through the streets, the bourgeois, the shopkeepers, the hotel keepers hastily closed their windows and doors. They pulled down the roller blinds. "There," said I, our eyes closing with the weariness of anxiety and fear. Naturally enough, the revolutionists, observing their effect, pulled up with a new braggart triumph. Not a single force, interventista or any other, set foot in the street to stop the irresponsibles. The beloved tricolor flag of Italy was taken as a mark. It was hastily taken off balconies. I remember an episode in the shame of those days. A woman, a school teacher in the popular quarters, ran to the defense of the Italian flag. Risking her life, she stood with blazing eyes against a herd of communists. You may be sure that in the period of redemption and resurrection, when we stood upright again, the golden medal for valor was bestowed on this woman of saintly courage. The Popolo d'Italia, of which I was the founder and editor, lived then its life of intense polemics. Every day was a battle. The little street of Via Paolo da Convobbio was constantly blocked by police, or by detachments of carabinieri and soldiers. All the staff were guarded whenever we appeared in public. One could understand that the government was anxious about us. The authorities wanted to control all that the Popolo d'Italia was doing and to curb all agitation for virile methods in the political struggle. The censorship was re-established exclusively and solely for the Popolo d'Italia. Through a backdoor channel, a disgusting socialist deputy tried also to bring about an inquiry. His proposal was ridiculed out the door. I wrote, on the next day after the procession of the defeat of Milan, an article the title of which was taken from a famous polemical book of Giordano Bruno, Against the Return of the Beast. That article was published in the Popolo d'Italia on the 18th of February and ended in these precise words. If the opposition to a war that is not only finished, but was victorious, is now a pretext for an ignoble doubt, then we who are not ashamed to have been interventiste, but feel the glory of our position, will shout to the heavens, "Stand back, you jackals! No one shall separate the dead. They constitute a sacred heap, as big as a gigantic pyramid that touches the skies, a heap that belongs to nobody. Nobody can give or take away from the dead. They do not belong to any party. They belong to the eternal motherland. They belong to a humanity too complex and too august to be put into any wine club or into the back room of some cooperative. This political stew is supremely ignominious. Must we be forced to defend our dead from filthy profanation? O Totti, Roman, one man, thy life and thy death is worth infinitely more than the whole Italian socialism. And you files on parade, innumerable heroes that wanted the war, knowing how to want war, who went to war knowing what was war, who went to death knowing what it meant to go to death. You, Decio Raggi, Filippo Corridoni, Cesare Battisti, Luigi Lori, Venezian, Sauro, Rismondi, Cantucci, you thousands and thousands of others that form the superb constellation of Italian heroism, don't you feel that the pack of jackals is trying to rummage your bones? Do they want to scrape the earth that was soaked with your blood and to spit on your sacrifice? Fear nothing, glorious spirits. Our task has just begun. No harm shall befall you. We shall defend you. We shall defend the dead and all the dead, even though we put dugouts in the public squares and trenches in the streets of our city. That was a warning blast, a trumpet call. Many, hit in the face, fled. Some around us, trembling, thought of the danger that they might get into on account of such a polemic, but some others, not many, gathered around the old banner of my newspaper. It was necessary to organize our resistance, to take care in discussions of international character, to strengthen our position on the front of internal politics, to be guarded from false friends, to fight false pacifists, and to confound the false humanitarians. We had to make a general assault upon all that bundle of various degenerate tendencies, diverse in their appearance, but absolutely identical in their utter failure to understand the logical and absolute meaning of the victory in war. Our delegation in Paris was in a sorry strait. The ability and injustice of some of the Allied statesmen had almost strangled it. Owing to our internal situation, it was impossible for our delegation to take a firm stand with feet well planted. The regions to be restored to Italy were in a state of restlessness that made many of us anxious. What a grave moment! An action of a handful of us on the public square was not sufficient. There were so many different fronts where one had to fight. We who were to defend Italy from within had to create one more unbreakable unity of strength, a common denominator of all the old pro-war partisans and loyalists, of all those who felt like myself, desperately Italian. Then it was that I decided, after days and nights of reflection, to make a call through the medium of my newspaper for a full stop in the stumbling career toward chaos. And on the 23rd of March, 1919, I laid down the fundamental basis at Milan of the Italian Fasci di Combattimento, the Fighting Fascist Program. The first meeting of the Italian battle fascists took place on the Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. It was in a hall offered to us by the Milan Association of Merchants and Shopkeepers. The permission was granted after a long discussion among the managers of the association. Common sense prevailed in the end. A guarantee was given that no noise or disorder would occur. On that condition, we got what we wanted. The meeting was of a purely political character. I had advertised in the Popolo d'Italia that it would have for its object the foundation of a new movement, and the establishment of a program and of methods of action for the success of the battle I was intending to fight against the forces dissolving victory and the nation. I prepared the atmosphere of that memorable meeting by editorials and summonses published in the Popolo d'Italia. Anyhow, the ones that came were not numerous. One of my fighting friends of goodwill was in the hall, and he took the names of those who were willing to sign up. After 2 days of discussion, 54 persons signed our program and took the pledge to be faithful to the fundamental basis of our movement. I speak of movement and not of party, because my conception was always that fascism must assume the characteristics of being anti-party. It was not to be tied to old or new schools of any kind. The name Italian Fighting Fascisti was lucky. It was most appropriate to a political action that had to face all the old parasites and programs that had tried to deprave Italy. I felt that it was not only the anti-socialist battle we had to fight. This was only a battle on the way. There was a lot more to do. All the conceptions of the so-called historical parties seemed to be dresses out of measure, shape, style, usefulness. They had grown tawdry and insufficient, unable to keep pace with the rising tide of unexpected political exigencies, unable to adjust to the formation of new history and new conditions of modern life. The old parties clung in vain to the rattling programs. These parties had to make pitiful repairs and tinkerings in an attempt to adapt their theories as best they could to the new days. It was therefore not sufficient to create, as some have said superficially, an anti-altar to the altar of socialism. It was necessary to imagine a wholly new political conception, adequate to the living reality of the 20th century, overcoming at the same time the ideological worship of liberalism, the limited horizons of various spent and exhausted democracies, and finally, the violently utopian spirit of Bolshevism. In a word, I felt the deep necessity of an original conception capable of placing in a new period of history a more fruitful rhythm of human life. It was necessary to lay the foundation of a new civilization. To this end, Through every day's observation of events and change, morning and evening, in vigor and in weariness, I aimed all my strength. I had a perfect and sure consciousness of the end I was driving at. This was my problem. To find a way, to find the moment, to find the form. Those discussions over which I presided and dominated strengthened some of my conceptions that still conserve today the freshness of the original idea. Later, in this review of my life until now, I shall take up some of the details of the evolution of our plans. At our meetings, there were present various elements: syndicalists, old interventionists, demobilized officers still in uniform, and many arditi, those brave grenade and knife shock troops of the war. The Italian arditi were a creation of the war. The idea was born in Garibaldi's impetuous fighting vigor and dash, and finds its remote origin in the heroic city militias that flourished in many parts of Italy at the happy time of the townships, the communes. The arditi rendered first-class service during the war. They were our troops of assault, of the first rush. They threw themselves into the battle with bombs in hands, with daggers in the teeth, with a supreme contempt for death, singing their magnificent war hymns. There was in them not only the sense of heroism, but an indomitable will. This typically Italian formation lived on after the war. The first fighting fascisti were formed mostly of decided men. They were full of will and courage. In the first years of the anti-socialist, anti-communist struggle, the arditi war veterans played an important role. I was sometimes nominated their chief and still hold the title of honorary president of the Arditi Association, with the idea of maintaining intact its spirit of civic and military virtues. Those who came to the meeting for the constitution of the Italian Fascisti of Combat used few words. They did not exhaust themselves by laying out dreams. Their aim seemed clear and straight-lined. It was to defend the victory at any price, to maintain intact the sacred memory of the dead, and the admiration not only for those who fell and for the families of those who were dead, but for the mutilated, for the invalids, for all those who had fought. The prevalent note, however, was of anti-socialist character, and as a political aspiration, it was hoped a new Italy would be created that would know how to give value to the victory and fight with all its strength against treason and corruption, against decay within and intrigue and avarice from without. There are some who profess not to understand what fascismo had as its intent, and some who believe that it grew without a gardener. I was certain at the time that it was necessary to fix without any possibility of equivocation the essential brand of the new movement. For this reason, I made 3 planks for our platform. The first was the following. The meeting of the 23rd of March sends its first greeting and reverent thought to the sons of Italy who died for the greatness of their country and for the freedom of the world, to the mutilated and to the invalids, to all those who fought, to the ex-prisoners who fulfilled their duty. It declares itself ready to uphold with all its energy the material and moral claims that will be put forward by the associations of those who fought. The second declaration pledged the Fascisti of Combat to oppose themselves to the imperialism of any other countries damaging to Italy. It accepted the supreme postulates of the League of Nations regarding Italy. It affirmed the necessity to complete the stability of our frontiers between the Alps and the Adriatic with the claim of annexation of Fiume and Dalmatia. The third declaration spoke of the elections that were announced for the near future. In this motion, the Fasci di Combattimento pledged themselves to fight with all their means the candidates that were milk and water Italians, to whatever party they belonged. Finally, we talked of organization, the organization that would be adapted to the new movement. I did not favor any bureaucratic, cut-and-dried organization. It was thought wise that in every big town, the correspondent of the Popolo d'Italia should be the organizer of a section of the Fasci di Combattimento, with the idea that each group should become a center of fascist ideas, work, and action. The first expenses, amounting to a few thousand lire, were covered by the feeble resources of the Popolo d'Italia. A central committee was formed to guide the whole movement. It is amusing for me to recall that this meeting remained almost unnoticed. The stupid irony of the socialists and the narrow-minded incomprehensiveness of the Italian Liberal Party could not grasp its significance. The Corriere della Sera, that great liberal newspaper, dedicated to this news about 20 lines in its columns. The internal situation in Italian politics and Italian policy continued to be nebulous and full of uncertainty. Disillusion and the shattering of ideals could be noticed even among those who had fought. A sense of weariness dominated all classes, everyone. The church, which had put herself apart during the great European conflict, now started activity in order to have her voice listened to at the peace negotiations and to have a say about all the questions that interested the nations that had taken part in the war. So far as our national life was concerned, the church limited her action to the creation of the Partito Popolare, the so-called popular or Catholic party. It was faithful to some important program points regarding the family and religion and the nation. It represented at that time an attempt to stop the prevalent diffusion of those Bolshevik ideas of socialistic and parliamentary systems that were then disintegrating Rome and the provinces. But the Partito Popolare itself ran off the rails and jumped the fences. It tried to compete with the socialists themselves. Of little and doubtful patriotic faith, it ran square against the Fascisti and the Interventisti. The Popular Party, along with the others, was too much in a hurry to close the parenthesis of the war. Political riots, disturbances, and strikes took place alternately in a kind of sickly rotation in every Italian city. It is necessary for me to review the conditions which we faced. Orlando, president of the council, was incapacitated by temperament to dominate the internal situation, just as he was unable to be a master in foreign affairs. His work was contradictory, full of false sentimentality and failure to comprehend the real interests of Italy. Not knowing French and ignorant of the treaties concluded with the Allied nations, Orlando, in spite of the presence of Sonnino, was a disastrous influence during the peace negotiations at Versailles. Wilson, so far as Italy was concerned, was ambiguous, so much so that on the 23rd of April, the Italian delegation had to leave Paris. It returned on the 5th of May, a dubious situation. In June, after a vote of the chamber, the Orlando cabinet retired. In the meantime, also in June, serious clashes took place at Fiume between French sailors and Italian soldiers. Never did Italy have a man so damaging to the Italian interests and programs as he who came next, Nitti. He was, and remains, a personality that is the negation of any ideals of life and of manly conflict. He has a fairly good knowledge of finances. He is impudent in his assertions. He is intensely egocentric. He always wants to play the most important part in cabinets, whether he is president of the council or simply a minister. His first act when he came into power was the granting of amnesty. This amnesty was followed by two others. The first had a character of general principle, and I approved it, but by granting the two others, Nitti committed a great moral crime, for he abolished the difference between those who wore the ensigns of valor and sacrifice and those who had basely betrayed the nation during the war and had even gone over to the enemy. All the work of Nitti was fish bait for the approbation of the socialists. He conceived the ambition of holding the presidency of a future Italian republic. His measures, which wore demagogic dress, did not prevent disorders or devastations, sometimes brought about with the cost of lives. He would never face Bolshevism and the dissolutive forces in the open field. He had a decree issued and signed by the king establishing the price of bread. He had it withdrawn on the next day and replaced by another decree also signed by His Majesty. There was no point in the national life that he failed to bring up for discussion. All this puffed up the socialists. They laughed in their sleeves as they foresaw strong political success for them at the elections. The elections had to take place under the proportional system. The socialists would become, through the election battle, masters of Italian political life. It seemed to me that the season was our summer of torment and resolve. In June 1919, the Treaty of Peace with Germany was consummated at Versailles. The event for Europe was the end of a nightmare. The continual disillusionments, the reservations, and the protests of Germany, and the diatribes between the Allies constituted a permanent danger and a reason for anxiety for many nations. The conclusion of the treaty was therefore for them a liberation. For Italy, on the contrary, it was a complete shattering of ideals. We had won the war. We were utterly defeated in the diplomatic battle. We were losing, except Zara, the whole of Dalmatia, our land, by tradition and history, by manners and costumes, by the language spoken, and by the ardent and constant aspirations of the Dalmatians toward the mother country. Fiume, most Italian of cities, was contested. The colonial problem was resolved for us in an absolutely negative way. To a nation like ours, powerful and prolific, that has a need of raw materials, of outlets, of markets, and of land, on account of the exuberance of its population, only some insignificant rectifications of frontiers were granted when the glut of colonial spoil was passed around. I could feel the discontent oozing down through our masses and infecting the combattenti themselves. Once more, Italy, who had thrown into the conflict men, means, patrimony, and youth, went out of a peace settlement with empty hands and manifold disillusions. The Nitti government, with its continuous note of pessimism, was doing no better than to describe our situation as near to bankruptcy, economic as well as political. Nitti himself, his newspapers, and his acolytes tried to make the Italian people believe that the Versailles Treaty was for us the best result obtainable. A sense of humiliation had crawled over our whole peninsula, but many there were who did not want to resign themselves to accept the tragic facts. No one knows better than I that many meditated in sullen silence most desperate actions. The government was watching the turn of the psychological tide, while in the practical field it did not know what to do except to prepare and revise the mechanism of an election law by a vicious proportional system. In the field of destruction, it had reached an unbelievable decision to demobilize the aviation camps. And to cap the climax, in August 1919, the report of the Commission of Inquiry on the painful episode of Caporetto was published. I thought to myself, this is fat on the fire. The Avanti, a socialist newspaper that for the time being was published in 3 editions, one at Turin, one at Rome, and one at Milan, had started a ferocious campaign against the army. On account of a strike of typographers, the Avanti was the only newspaper published in Rome for 2 months. During street demonstrations, officers, merely because they were in uniform, were insulted and assaulted. Charity toward the dignity of the nation prevents my presentation of episodes that now make the worst blackguards blush. The few fascisti that had accomplished an act of faith in March 1919 now met in all their work enormous difficulties. They were isolated, attacked, spied upon, sometimes by the subversives, sometimes by the government. Every day in the Popolo d'Italia I wrote about the painful bath of fire of the combattenti, about the inflamed pride of the volunteers, about the necessity of concord, about the sordid hostility of the government that did not feel the beauty and the greatness of the sense of patriotic heroism. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the poet who lived in Rome, wrote that his approbation of my good shots was trembling with admiration. Victory was losing her laurel leaves every day in spite of all. The National Parliament was discussing and approving the new election laws. Disorders and blackmailing of the government were on the daily calendar. The debates had a character of pettiness and gossip, and the flavor of a base world that knew nothing of war, virtue, or heroism. Elections, 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 thought I. These constitute the only subject that is able to rise to its feet in the Italian parliament. Incidents had taken place at Fiume between Italians and French sailors, and the population of that city did not hide its growing hostility toward the Allies. The latter therefore planned to have the city garrisoned by a mixed corps of their troops. So Fiume, a city purely of virile Italian stamp, had a mosaic of troops. It was the summit of inefficiency and, what is more, of stupidity. D'Annunzio, who was trembling in his solitude, told me that he contemplated with grim brooding the taking of Fiume by force. There was no other way of salvation. Everything seemed to be lost. There were only a handful of men with the poet, but they were the most trustworthy elements of our army. They were old volunteers. They were fascists who felt once again in the incandescent atmosphere of the streets of Rome and other cities the poetry of the war and of the victory. They started, armed from Ronchi. The occupation of Fiume, at the moment when the English sailors were getting ready to evacuate it, was rapid and startling. The government, as soon as it knew the truth, wanted to rush to offset the raid. It meditated a blockade. It sent thunder against the rebels, but D'Annunzio and his legionaries, having prepared their action in silence, now threw down a gauntlet of audacious challenge to the Nitian triflings. Gabriele D'Annunzio, before starting from Ronchi, wrote me the following letter. Dear companion, the dice are on the table. Tomorrow I shall take Fiume with force of arms. The God of Italy assist us. I arise from bed with fever, but it is impossible to delay. Once more the spirit dominates the miserable flesh. Sum up the article that the Gazzetta del Popolo will publish. Give the end in full. Sustain the cause without stint during the conflict. I embrace you. Gabriele D'Annunzio, 11 September, 1919. The Italian atmosphere, so long checked and humiliated, exploded like Vesuvius after the announcement of the new D'Annunzio gesture. Again we heard the tune of high sentiments of fraternity and of enthusiasm. Again we felt the spirit of May 1915. The best of our manhood felt the breath of poetry that came from this sacred liberation carried on in the face of the policy of the Nitian government. The fascisti were amongst the ardent legionaries of Fiume, while at home they were leading resistance against the defeatists, old and new. The Italian colonists all over the world, these colonists who had followed with anxiety and with unspeakable fright the negotiations of Versailles, sent money in great quantity for D'Annunzio's expedition. Fiume felt an intuition of its salvation. There were manifestations of frantic enthusiasm. Audacity had repaired injustice. The city was strongly held, so that it could resist by force of arms and with courage all the Nitian or international interference. The president of the council, Nitti, in Parliament on this occasion, took an ignoble attitude. He summoned up the dangerous idea of protest by a general strike. By his ambiguous language, he invited the classes which leaned towards socialism, and especially the socialists and radicals themselves, to agitate for street demonstrations against D'Annunzio's enterprise. Nitti, after conversations with Trumbik, the Yugoslav minister, saw all his tangled and slimy net of humiliating understandings going to pieces through the will of a few brave boys. Nitti thought and acted only as a consequence of physical fear, attacked full front and exasperated in his mad and miserable dream. He plotted with every means to overcome the resistance of the Fiumian legionaries. The soldiers were declared deserters. The city was blockaded so that economic pressure would squeeze the spirit of the citizens. Parliament was closed, and the elections were fixed for November 16th, 1919, under the troublesome proportional system. The elections re-established, for a moment, an apparent truce. Every party wanted to measure the masses and the groupings. The socialists, who were speculating on the misfortunes of the war, and were pointing to the danger of another war due to the Danuncian enterprise, were the favorites. The church, which in politics always has an ambiguous attitude, urged on the activity of the priests in the villages so that the Partito Popolare, which had been created originally by the lay Catholics in service of the church policy, might play the preponderant part in Parliament. The Liberals, Democrats, and some radicals put up a bloc that passed under the name of the Forces of Order. They were changeable forces without any ideal base and without precise aims. They were another grouping among groupings whose futilities I had observed for years. I wanted the fascisti to try alone the chance of the elections. We did not ally ourselves with any other party, even with the nearest to them, the nationalists. The atmosphere was against us, but it was necessary to count our own heads. It was necessary to know, even through the means of elections, what point had been reached by the Italian nation in moral disintegration and in moral reawakening as a victorious nation. I created an electoral committee with little means, but with ample courage. I ordered meetings for the principal towns of Italy, and especially in Milan. I remember so vividly the meeting on the Piazza Belligioioso, how typical it was. The place was a lonesome corner of old Milan, where from a camion that was used for a tribune on a dark night, by the light of torches, I addressed a big, closely pressed crowd. They were people not only from Milan, but from other towns. The fascisti of Bologna, of Turin, of Rome, and of Naples had in fact sent their representatives in order to have precise rules and sure orders for the impending electoral battle. I made on this occasion some declarations of principles that still stand in the fascist line. They have served me as a guide in all my political actions. I said that revolutions were not to be denied a priori, that they might be discussed. I said that the Italian people could not copy Russian Bolshevism. We have in the history of our political struggles our own elements of greatness of concept. These have given to the spirit of the time all the strength of their Italian genius and the qualities of their Italian courage. If a revolution, said I, has to take place, it is necessary to make one typically Italian, on the magnificent dimensions of the ideas of Mazzini and with the spirit of Carlo Pisacane. I had already in my mind clear and strong the concept of a complete rebellion against the decrepit old state that did not of itself know how to die. The elections of the 16th of November took place, and the fascisti were beaten. I faced, and all of us faced, complete defeat. Not one of us had the necessary votes to become a member of parliament. Some nationalists saved themselves in Rome and were later excellent interpreters of the national idea in the wallow of general bewilderment. At Milan, I was a long way off from the number of votes necessary to be elected. It was tragic, our record, but in the passage of time, it is amusing and may be remembered by all losers. Our uneasiness was now profound. The crowd was anti-fascist. Under the skin of the population, a sad illusion was being fed. In their minds, a dark hope was stirring. The coming of Bolshevism. The plan for seizing the means of production, The installation of the Soviets in Italy. The Avanti had already published the general scheme and its details. My defeat did not bother me out of any personal consideration. It gave me a clear and precise idea of the desperateness of our situation. The socialist newspaper wrote on that occasion a short notice about me. "A dead body has been fished up from the Naviglio." It was said in this note that in the night, in the modest Naviglio Canal that cuts Milan in two, a dead body had been picked up. According to the documents, they said it could be identified as the dead body of Benito Mussolini, his political corpse. They did not say that its eyes were gazing ahead. Amidst the general feast of their victory, the socialists did not forget to imitate a regular funeral. This parade passed through the streets with a coffin surrounded with burning candles. There were ribald psalms on the air. The strange procession, however, showed the distress and shoddiness of its ranks. It passed up and down the city of Milan, a city that had become now the absolute property of the socialists. The procession passed under the windows of my house, where my family was living in anxiety amidst the general anxieties, and with violence trembling in the air. I have not forgotten the episode, but I always see it in its frame, the frame of the misery and of the threadbareness of the paraders. The elections had given 150 seats to the socialists in Parliament. They were themselves frightened by their staggering success. The situation was saved by the south of Italy, always more faithful to men than to organized mass parties. The victory, of course, swelled up in most socialists a desire to dominate. It distended their impudent abuse of power. Enormous processions with red flags howling in the streets, strikes called not for protest but for celebration, occupied a whole week. At Milan, a crowd of 30,000 demanded that the red flag should be exposed on the municipal building. During the cock crowing over victory, all institutions, rules, and regulations and orderly life were upset. Nobody thought about work. That last of all. Only an audacious handful formed by fascisti arditis and Fumian elements resisted the intoxication. An incident was provoked because of this. Bombs were thrown. A few were killed and many wounded. A commission of socialist members of parliament, headed by Filippo Turati, marched up the stairs of the Prefettura, the governor's office of Milan, to claim my arrest and the arrest of the fascisti chiefs. That was an episode of political partisanship useless and evil. The authorities showed weakness and fear. They wanted to give satisfaction to the socialists. But my clear and straight-line political action did not suffer from this abuse of power. Having been let out after only 1 day of imprisonment, I consulted with my associates as to the whole work before us. What should we do now? How could we act before the damage to Italy became irreparable? The electoral tragedy had broken up our central committees. Many of us had been arrested. Many, threatened, had disappeared. Little by little, calm having been restored, I rewove at the Popolo d'Italia the fabric of our cause, and tried to build again the structure of our organization. In various meetings, I explained the gravity of the Italian situation. I spoke independently of the particular attitude of the fascisti. The victory of the socialists was a danger, not so much because of the fact itself as because of the phenomenal retreat to their holes of all the weak and the incapables which followed the day after the socialist victory. That victory crushed the liberals and the Democrats. For some time, a low, furtive literature of propaganda had spread stories about disquieting episodes in the defeated German and Austrian countries. This literature spun narratives about professors obliged to become servants and scullions, Russian princesses engaged as ballet dancers, generals who were selling matches on the streets. All this put together with the socialist victory produced a wave of fright in all classes, and I could see a serious fact of corruption and political paralysis. The old parties had been beaten by pussyfoot socialism. That socialism had no aim. It was victorious only through cowardice in the others, and because of the general uneasiness in the population. Certainly, it did not win on any declaration of great faith. I did not fold under the smallest edge of my flag. From my editor's office that was getting barer and barer, to my readers that were getting fewer and fewer, I addressed the most bitter and severe exhortations to resist, resist, resist. I made a little fortress out of the editor's office. The newspaper was sequestrated and censored every day, but notwithstanding difficulties and lack of means, I succeeded in keeping the little paper alive. I was throttled by the skinny hand of poverty. I could have sold out, but I held on. So that I might be completely withdrawn from circulation, various messengers of the Nitian government came to me advising to go and study the autonomous republics of southern Russia. I understood the double game. They acted with me as they acted with D'Annunzio when they advised him to try the flight from Rome to Tokyo. But D'Annunzio is still resisting at Fiume, and I, with my newspaper, was renewing and reassembling the dispersed ranks of the fascisti. I held meetings constantly. Not for a moment did I cease my activity. It cannot be said that I failed to look the triumphant beast in the face. One day, just after the elections, I had to go personally because of postal regulations to the money order window of the main post office in Milan. I was to receive some considerable contributions that Italians from overseas colonies were sending for the Fiume enterprise. In the huge buildings of the central post office, one could still see visible signs of the elections. The murmur of discussions, the stenciled inscriptions on the walls were all there. I presented myself with my brother Arnaldo at the window of the money order office. The Bolshevik clerk, with evident irony, said I had to make myself known. He did not know any certain Benito Mussolini. A short discussion arose that attracted other Bolshevik elements who amused themselves by affirming that nobody knew Benito Mussolini. The development of this discussion, impudently provoking, was stopped by an old clerk of the post office, a faithful servant of the state who certainly was not intoxicated by the socialist success. He said, "Pay this money transfer. Do not be silly. Mussolini has a name that is not only known now here, but will be known and judged all over the world." I've never learned the name of that gentleman. He was straight and fair. Some symptoms of reaction against the socialist victory were to be noticed now. One day at the editor's office of the newspaper, facing the anxieties of my associates and the doubts of some half-hearted ones in my service, I felt it necessary to disclose my own hopes and faiths. Don't fear. Italy will heal herself from this illness. But without our watchfulness, it might be deadly. We will resist. Resist, I should say so. Indeed, within 2 years, I will have my turn.